This is Comic Geek Speak, episode 1538, Spotlight on Shazam in the Golden Age, Part 1.
I'm Shane Kelly.
I'm Adam Murdough.
And I'm Chris Eberly.
All right. Welcome to the show. This episode, as Professor Murdough for this episode said, is all about Shazam, a spotlight on Shazam in the Golden Age. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of Comic Geek Speak is brought to you by Comic Castle at comiccastle.com. They specialize in back issue comics, collectibles, and action figures. Their back issues go back as far as the Silver Age. Buy as many issues as you want for $3.95 shipping. Any orders over $5 get shipped in a rigid box wrapped in bubble wrap. I went to go bubble wrap rigid at the same time. Everything else on their website qualifies for free shipping. Their action figures specialize in superhero, Star Wars, and Star Trek. For their collectibles, they have statues, busts, and the popular pop figures, which are all the rage right now. They're longtime listeners of the show, and we want to help support them. Use code CGS10 for 10% off of your first order. That's comiccastle.com. Thank you very much. Professor, I shall turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Producer Shane. Well,
a coup. Anyway.
Big shoes I'm filling here. Stepping up to the CGS lectern to present this spotlight on, we call it Shazam, but mainly for the purpose of disambiguation, just in case people think they're going to be getting a couple hours of talk about an expatriate Kree soldier. But no. This is the Golden Age original Fawcett Publications Captain Marvel we're going to be talking about.
If you want to be technical, the Marvel version is Captain Marvel anyway, so you would be forgiven for saying Captain Marvel.
But his the titles of his book were always
very
Captain
true.
Marvel, so that was sort of his trade name, you might say.
Indeed.
So here we are. We're going to pay homage to one of the greatest comics characters of all time, one of the greats of the Golden Age and beyond. And we have to start at the beginning, naturally, when we're talking about a character whose roots go back that far in comics history, all the way back to 1940. In fact, his first appearance was cover dated February of 1940, which is why I wanted to get this episode in the can this month, because this is the diamond anniversary of the Billy Batson Captain Marvel and his whole, the Marvel concept, anyway. I was about to say the whole Marvel family, but they didn't all appear until after 1940. But technically, the Marvel family has its ultimate genesis in Whiz Comics number 2, February of 1940. That is where we will begin. But before we do, we have to, procedures must be observed here. So we'll begin, as we usually do, by giving our initial impressions of the character, sharing whatever knowledge and thoughts and opinions we have about the Golden Age Captain Marvel to start out here. I'll go first. The first time I ever heard about Captain Marvel as a character was well before I started reading comics. I remember this. I read about him in a little paperback book that I'm pretty sure was a Scholastic paperback. I'm sure I got it at a book fair or something. It wasn't even about comics or superheroes. It was a book about famous monsters of film and literature. And the author of this little thing decided to devote several pages to Mr. Mind's Monster Society of Evil, which is a very important storyline in Cap's Golden Age. We'll hear about it as we go along in our spotlight here today. And it talks about how this heroic figure, this Captain Marvel, I'm not even sure when I was reading it that I realized I was reading about something that happened in the comics. I think I assumed it was a radio serial, because you don't usually hear nowadays the term serial bandied about as a word for a comic storyline. But that is what Fawcett chose to call the Monster Society story, because comics was a very new medium, and sometimes it had to borrow its terminology from other more established media, such as film and radio. And so, serial. But anyway, so I read about Captain Marvel's epic, protracted battle with Mr. Mind and his army of monsters, human and otherwise. And it was kind of interesting, and the name Captain Marvel just kind of lodged itself in my brain at that point. But I didn't know more specifics about Captain Marvel as a character, who he was, his powers, his alter ego of Billy Batson, and all of that stuff, until much later. And at that point, when it comes down to breaking down my familiarity with Captain Marvel thus far, I don't know exactly where to locate it. I don't know when and where exactly I found out about the whole Shazam thing and the alter ego and so on and so forth. But I definitely knew about it by the time early 1995 rolled around and the Power of Shazam ongoing series started coming out by Jerry Ordway. And I jumped on board and read that book ardently, and I've loved Captain Marvel and his world ever since. Even though at the time, I think I sort of got the impression that what I was reading was not quite the same Captain Marvel that readers had seen in the 40s. Indeed, how could it have been 50 years distant? But I liked what I saw, and I'm very pleased to have been... It took me this long, really, to do the research, to dig into all of the comics of Captain Marvel's Golden Age and learn just what Jerry Ordway was paying tribute to in that Power of Shazam series that I enjoyed in the mid-'90s. I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I think it's... And whenever I think of Captain Marvel, the Golden Age really is the first thing I think of, because it is Captain Marvel's classical period. It was his heyday. It was when he dominated the stands, when he, as so often said, and we'll say it a couple of times in this episode too, he outsold Superman. He was the most popular superhero of the Golden Age for a time. Like his own solo series, Captain Marvel Adventures, actually bore the legend on the front cover, the largest selling comics magazine. It's just practically boasting of the fact that he was outselling Superman. And he's just become so inextricably linked with that period of comics history. And, the fact that his Golden Age was cut tragically short, and we won't get into that so much in this episode. There will be a part 2 where we'll deal with that in a little more detail. It's kind of precluded him from outgrowing his association with this era, with the Golden Age. And other interpretations of the Captain since then, although many of them have a merit of their own, they've never been quite able to recapture the magic of those original stories from the Golden Age. And now that I've been able to read them myself personally firsthand, I think I understand what all the fuss is about. So I'm very much looking forward to talking about this with everyone listening in and my brethren here in the studio. But first... Chris, Shane, whoever would like to go first.
Go ahead.
Honored brothers. First of all, I have to note for the listeners what a wonderful job Murdough did on his notes. These are outstanding. I mean, this is just a great overview of Captain Marvel's entire history through 1945, and this is probably just as good as anything I would read in a encyclopedia entry or anything like that. This is outstanding. Well done, Murdough. Well done indeed.
Thank you very much, Chris. You were my role model in assembling these notes.
You're too kind, my friend. For me, I've been very excited since Murdough mentioned that we're going to do this months ago, because my knowledge of Captain Marvel is very limited. I mean, I know the basics. I know the place of the character in history. I certainly know about how he outsold Superman and that whole legal battle and what happened there. But I was never that well versed in all the more colorful details of the character and his supporting cast, his villains, and so forth. And in fact, as I think about it now, my first exposure to Captain Marvel, I'm sure Shane can appreciate this, is that incredibly cheesy, albeit fun show that was on Saturday mornings in the late 70s, I believe, where I think he shared the show with ISIS.
He did.
And I can remember as a very little kid in the late 70s, I was 5, 6 years old. So I was born in 1973. Watching that show, having no clue really what it was all about. Just, there was this gentleman who I remember now in hindsight as an adult probably wasn't really that muscular, or he was just kind of a guy in this leotard, right, running around with a thunderbolt on his chest. And I remember, it's it was on where I was watching in New Jersey. They put on like right around the same time as Land of the Lost. So I would get my full dose of Slee Stacks, which fascinated me as a child. And, what was the name of that family? Do you remember Land of the Lost, what they're called?
Oh.
Marshall, Will, and Holly.
Yeah.
I don't remember their last name, though.
Them going over the waterfall and the whole thing. And then around the same time, in that programming, Then the Captain Marvel. I'm sure they called him Shazam. Actually, I would think in the show.
Well, that was the title of the show. But
Shazam, ISIS,
Hour or something
come on.
like that.
But the character himself must have been called Captain Marvel in the show. They just couldn't call the show that.
Because of the copyright with Marvel Comics. But so that was my first exposure to Captain Marvel. And as a comic reader, I never really had exposure to Golden Age Captain Marvel comics. I hadn't really read anything. And then as I became older, I became cognizant of, there's this Captain Marvel character I remember as a child on this television show in modern DC Comics. I remember seeing him in Justice League on the cover.
Yep.
Then later on, as a much older kid, adult I should say, I would see him in JSA. I knew of the Jerry Ordway series, but I have not read it. I still haven't read it, which I'm ashamed of because I know it's great and I really want to read it.
I'm sure you've got most of a run at Wild
Yeah, we have them. In fact, I think I have the first trade in our library at the store, too, based on your recommendation of it. So I have to read that.
It is good stuff.
Yeah, I have no doubt. The art is breathtaking in it. This is very exciting for me because as someone who loves not just the characters, but the history of comics and all the behind-the-scenes, the politics, the business decisions, the intrigue, the people getting screwed over, all the stuff that went on in this era of the sort of the creation of all these legendary characters. I'm really excited to learn about filling in all the gaps for my knowledge because, again, I know how important Captain Marvel is as a character and his place in the history of the comic book media in the United States, but I'm very eager to learn more about just his, let's say, his month-to-month adventures and his, his powers, his interaction. I know about like Mac Raboy and his art and, the whole family, but I never really have read any of these stories. So I'm very excited about this. Well done, Mert.
I have to agree on a lot of points that you made, Chris. I'm very much the same way in that I only learned about the character watching that TV show too. And I think it was on ABC for me, which would have been Channel 6 up here out of Philly. I could be wrong on that. I'm sure there's a site that would tell me that. But after that, the next time I remember seeing him or paying attention was the Justice League from '86 when I started reading that. And that was when I was really starting to get into comics, especially DC stuff. Beyond that, it wasn't until I was, so that would have been, I was about 13 when I started reading that, 12, 13. It would have been in my 20s when I started learning more history about it, that it was a Fawcett character first, that there was a whole history beyond what I knew from years and years ago. I just always assumed at that point that it was a DC character, and then learned about all the other different characters that DC has gobbled up over the years. Always wanted to read The Power of Shazam myself. I have a few issues as it would cross over with whatever titles that it did. I think it did Starman for a few issues.
It did cross over with Starman.
And those...
Yes. Lightning and Stars, that was the name of that story.
Those I have and I've read. But other than that, I haven't read much. I do have that one hardback graphic novel that Jerry Ordway did too, I think.
Oh, right. That was the start of his whole take on Captain Marvel and his friends.
And I haven't even read that yet, but I've had that in my collection for years. So
when we get to Captain Marvel in the 90s, that'll be your opportunity.
I'm really anxious to do that and not only get through some things that I have in my collection surrounding Captain Marvel, but just learn about the history of him, different adventures he went through. I was quizzing Mert a little bit with some questions I had even before this, so I'm excited to see and hear all the stuff that started and is still with Captain Marvel, because a lot of times things start but don't make it through history, even in the closest same way. But Captain Marvel has a lot of characters and powers, origin history that stuck with him and is still there, which is fabulous.
Oh yeah, well they were cranking out 5 or 6 Captain Marvel stories a month for a while there. Well, actually for a little while, his Captain Marvel Adventures series was bi-weekly.
Wow!
So even more content there, so that they had to sort of riff, do experiment, come up with different concepts, kind of like Mort Weisinger did with Superman eventually. So yeah, that's hence the rich history to which you refer.
And I never minded. Like, I've heard debates over the years about, well, Captain Marvel's just as strong as Superman. What's the point in having him? But I like the fact that Captain Marvel is Billy Batson, a young boy given these powers to be a superhero. So he has that wide-eyed starriness about him as well, and naivete at times. And I like the fact that if anything would happen for either character to go bad, as we somewhat see in Kingdom Come way down the road, they have options to combat each other as well. You know, Superman can't take the magic side of things and is just as powerful as Shazam if he catches them off guard. Like, to me, they never were the same character, even that close, because Martian Manhunter is just as powerful too, but still a little bit different. I never minded that. I'm always happy to see Captain Marvel and Superman all in the same universe doing very different things at times.
And the other thing I'm excited about this is to learn more about Fawcett as a company, because we may forget, you know, in the 21st century, how important Fawcett was as a comic book company in the Golden Age. How, as Murd mentioned before, what a presence they had on the stands. And you know, you have the Fawcett Companion, which I forgot was because it's out of print now from tomorrow's. I'd love to take a look at that later, actually, Murd. But
you bet.
Very important. I mean, now today, all that's left of Fawcett is, you know, the vestige of it is they have Fawcett City, right? I don't even know if they have it in the New 52, actually, but. Certainly in the old DC universe,
I don't know if they do or not.
Probably do. I mean,
yeah.
I have
would
the
think.
trade of the Jeff Johns and Gary Frank Shazam stories.
I haven't read
them
that,
in Justice League, but I haven't really read them.
Yeah.
Well, at least not closely enough to know where they take place.
So
I would be surprised if there weren't such a thing as Fawcett City. Though.
Right. So I hope there is, but you know, I'm also just interested in the backstory of this company because, my God, like Murd said, they were outselling Superman. And that's a whole nother, we'll get into that later on, the whole legalese of that.
Yeah.
Not legalese, but the whole legal situation and, you know, what happened to the character. And although I believe Fawcett continued as a company after they lost Captain Marvel.
Oh.
They did. You are
I
correct.
think
They
they
just ceased publication
published magazines, basically.
Yes, they
after
did.
that.
They
Yeah.
did.
So they don't. It's long gone now, though, right?
Oh,
yeah. Okay.
They sold out to CBS in the late 70s, around
Okay.
the
Oh,
time
get
when
out.
the TV show was so hot.
Okay.
And after that, it was sold overseas, I think. But yeah,
All right.
See, I
Fawcett
had-
has not existed as an independent entity for a long time.
That's what I thought.
I had no idea they continued publishing anything after,
Yeah, they were still.
They lost
still
some of
did-
these characters.
They still had magazines. I remember reading that.
and I had no idea they lasted till the 70s. Wow.
Maestro, commence.
Thank you very much. The baton is passed. All right. So then, travel with us now, back in time. Not merely to 1940 when our story really begins, but still further beyond that. Because, Chris, you know, as when we began our series of Fantastic Four spotlights, as you've so rightly pointed out, the history of Fantastic Four is kind of the history of Marvel Comics as well. So we had to talk about the beginnings of the publishing firm as well as the beginnings of that
Indeed.
series. So we might as well take this opportunity to take a look at the origins of Fawcett as a company, which, as you said, interests you and hopefully will interest others as well. So, Fawcett Publications was founded in 1919, and they had sort of a charismatic founding father figure, just as, as DC National had Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, although he was not that important a figure in National's history, ultimately, as the gentleman I'm about to mention was to Fawcett. He just kind of got the ball rolling and then disappeared, left things over.
Well, he was bought out by Donenfeld and Leibowitz.
Donenfeld, yeah. And he was kind of a habitual drinker. But anyway, we've got kind of a raffish ex-military man behind Fawcett as well. The man's name is Captain Wilford H. Fawcett, known far and wide as Captain Billy.
Great.
He ran away from home at the age of 16, did the future Captain Billy, joined the Army. He served in the armed services during the Philippine insurrection of 1899.
One of the more brutal adventures in our American military history, but continue.
Yes. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Yes.
But that was not the last taste of combat he would have either. He came home for a little while, put in some time working as a police beat reporter, I think, for a Midwestern newspaper or two. And then when World War I started up, he charged back in, and this time he achieved the rank of captain. You know, put in his time serving his country during that conflict. And during his time in the Army in both of these conflicts, he spent some time working on the Stars and Stripes, which, as you know, is the in-house newspaper of the U.S. Army. And so he had some journalistic experience. He'd done some humor features there. And he'd also collected quite an extensive compilation of little anecdotes and jokes from his fellow servicemen and other people he'd met along the way. And when he got back to the United States, he decided that he would try his hand at building some kind of publication out of this, like to circulate a humor magazine, a joke book. And so thus was born Captain Billy's Whiz Bang. named after the sound of an exploding
Great.
mortar shell. Very familiar noise to World War I soldiers. And so he started that concern in 1919 in the Minneapolis suburb of Robbinsdale, Minnesota. And it turned out to be a pretty big hit, ultimately. You know, at its peak, it was regularly selling something like 500,000 copies nationwide.
That's extraordinary, yeah.
Yep. And so that was the Fawcett Publications empire was kind of built on the back of Captain Billy's Whiz Bang. It was just sort of just a little digest-sized. I actually have here a reproduction edition of that was published by Nat Gertler's Abstract Comics a little while ago, or was it? No, About Comics. Sorry, that's
Let
the
me
name
take
of
a
the
look.
company.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a reproduction of a 1922 copy. It's just like randy little jokes, snippets of doggerel verse, dirty limericks, here and there bits of little short humorous or racy anecdotes, movie gossip, reviews of recent plays. It was focused at a predominantly white, male, rural audience.
Well, here's a perfect example. Dear Captain Billy, what is a good name for a new college sorority? From Al E. Rat.
That's a
Felt
good
a
person.
thigh is the answer. Talk about a knee slapper. Fabulous.
Yeah, when this was solicited in previews a while ago, it was touted as the sort of thing your great-grandparents might have found funny. Shane, you want to take a look?
Yeah.
What's interesting is the term whiz bang. I've often heard Stan Lee use that term to describe, flashy, far-out technology or hot rods or
Just
things of that
something
nature.
sensational,
Yeah.
something flashy and sensational. Yeah, well, maybe that's Captain Billy's legacy to the language.
Could be.
But anyway, so he got that started in 1919, and it grew to be pretty big gangbusters. And eventually, the good captain... break out Muttley over there.
The old boys chatter. The fellow who marries a bow-legged girl these days has no excuse that he can't see what he's getting.
Wow.
Wow.
I get it. I wish I didn't.
That's fabulous.
So eventually Captain Billy, he had other projects on the side too. He started something called an Army and Navy Club, which is like a nightclub for veterans, and he had other pet projects too. And he built up kind of a special hunting resort someplace or other where he entertained celebrities. And he was a pretty prominent figure in the United States for a while, but then he kind of grew more and more distant from direct involvement with his publishing concerns. He left that to his 4 sons. And eventually those 4 sons decided that it was time that maybe Captain Billy had outgrown Robbinsdale and or maybe in order to keep on growing, because eventually sales on Captain Billy's Whiz Bang started to decline as the United States as a nation began to move past the kind of provincial humor that the Whiz Bang had to offer. So they sought greener pastures to the east, did the 4 Fawcett boys. And so in 1935, they moved the publishing offices of Fawcett Publications from Robbinsdale, Minnesota, although I understand that town to this day celebrates a special festival called Whiz Bang Days, to recall the salad days when they were like a national media hub. But the Fawcetts picked up and moved to the East Coast. They established their corporate headquarters in Greenwich, Connecticut, because in those days that was kind of the standard practice for publishers to have their
Didn't
offices.
Charlton have offices in Connecticut, too?
I think that they did,
Yeah,
yes.
that rings a bell.
Which
Okay.
is funny you should mention Charlton, because when Fawcett stopped publishing comics in the early 50s, a lot of their catalog of characters and titles and things were sold off to Charlton. But yeah, it was just kind of a standard thing for publishers to incorporate themselves in Connecticut, and while actually doing most of their business and the creation of the actual content down in New York. Just to it was kind of a tax dodge.
I assume so, yeah.
Things were expensive in New York. Taxes were kind of high. So they established their corporate headquarters in Greenwich, Connecticut, and they set up their main office on Broadway in New York City. And so that was in 1935. And then some years later, it was around somewhere in the middle of 1939, when it had become plain that comic books and superhero comic book stories were a coming thing. The popularity of Superman had been well established. Batman had just come along. Somebody in the Fawcett organization, the youngest of the 4 sons, Roscoe Fawcett, takes credit for this in an interview that I
Coltrane.
read.
Sorry, couldn't help it. Go ahead.
His middle initial might have been P, for all I know, but it was Roscoe Fawcett, and he takes credit for getting Fawcett into comics. But we have only his word for that. It's of dubious believability, I think. But anyway, whoever's idea it was, in 1939, they tapped out a young man who'd been working at Fawcett for only about 2 years. His name was Bill Parker. He had worked at the New York Herald Tribune prior to getting involved with Fawcett. He had a respectable journalistic background. He was Princeton educated. And they sat him down and said, you know what, you're going to be the first line editor for our new line of Fawcett comic books. And Bill Parker was game as always, and he rose to the challenge. I don't know that he knew that much about comic books at that time, but then again, in 1939, who did? It was a very young medium. It was still being invented as its creators went along. But anyway, he sat himself down and began to think out what the characters in this new line of Fawcett comic books were going to be. And one thing that the upper-ups at Fawcett, and they eventually put in place a sort of hierarchy at Fawcett. It was a fairly regimented company. The Fawcett brothers were at the top, of course. Directly below them, and sort of the bridge between them and the creative and editorial talent, were two figures, Ralph Day, who was the editorial director, and Al Allard, who was the art director. And they conversed with the editors below them, and the editors, and there was an executive editor who was like the editor-in-chief. And then the executive editor conferred with the editors, and the editors talked to the creators. And so Bill Parker was sort of expected to create a bunch of characters from whole cloth. And so he's kind of sat down and wrote out the entire content. So he created all the characters in Fawcett's first major comic series, Whiz Comics. They're all his creations, and I believe he wrote, personally, all the stories that appeared in the first issue of that series.
So is Bill Parker the creator, then, of Captain Marvel?
Or
Or is there a co-creator involved?
Well, of course, you have to credit the artist, and we will get to him because he's a very important figure in Captain Marvel's history, too. But before we get too much further, what I'd wanted to do and forgot to do before we started talking about Fawcett and everything related to it, and please forgive me here, everyone listening. I'm sounding a little bit frazzled and uncertain here. I'm spinning my wheels a bit, but... my brain is just loaded with information right now, and it doesn't know which orifice to come out of. I wanted to begin by giving a little due credit to my resources for this episode. The first and foremost, of course, are the DC Comics published hardcover Shazam archives. There were 4 volumes published, plus one of the Shazam family, which takes us up pretty much to the end of 1942, the first few years of these halcyon days of Fawcett Publications comics. I've also got my Millennium Edition copy of Whiz Comics number 2, which prior to beginning research for this episode was pretty much all the Golden Age Shazam comics I'd ever read. Also, Chris mentioned, and I'm happy to mention again, the Fawcett Companion, the best of the FCA standing
I wish
for...
that was still in print. Looks great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fawcett Collectors of America, which is really a collection of essays and interviews and such that saw print in the FCA newsletter and in FCA columns.
Just so people know, the FCA often shares space with the Alter Ego magazine, and still does to this day.
Which is a Tomorrow's publication itself.
Mm-hmm.
So this thing put out by Tomorrow's several years back is a collection of those. It's got a nice painted image on here by Jerry Ordway of a bunch of prominent Fawcett characters, including, of course, Captain Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel. It doesn't have all that much information in it about the characters themselves, but if you're looking for background dirt on the creators who made the Golden Age of Fawcett great, this is a great place to go. It's out of print right now, and Chris was lamenting that fact a little while ago. But if you go to the Tomorrow's website, there is a digital edition that may be downloaded and read digitally.
Well, Tomorrow's keeps... If they don't have again, I love this company. I've always praised it. If they don't have a hard copy, they do usually have a digital of everything. So it's all there in one form or another.
It's one way to keep their valuable publications in print. And I also tip the hat to Jim Steranko's History of Comics, the oversized tabloid version here.
Great.
Issue 2 has, the whole first couple of chapters are devoted to Captain Marvel, Marvel Family, and other Fawcett characters. So if you happen to have access to that, there's some good background on Fawcett characters there. And finally, a disclaimer. Please, I know there are a few of you out there who are very fond of Captain Marvel, and I'm trying to do justice to the character and to your love for him, but in case I get a few of my bits of information slightly fudged or altogether wrong, I'm calling on you to please be gentle with me. There's a lot of information out there about the Golden Age of Fawcett and Captain Marvel. trying to keep it all straight. If I get something wrong, and Eric Nolan Wethington of Tomorrows, I'm looking at you here. Please don't be too harsh in setting me straight. I've given you a plug here, Eric, so be gentle.
Well, Eric's often very helpful in the forums.
Extremely, yeah.
Always.
Picking up our slack all the time. I'm just asking him to be nice about it.
Oh, he always is.
All right, so getting back then to Bill Parker. His original idea for the character that ultimately became Captain Marvel was actually a group of 6 characters. It was like a team, each of which possessed a different, mythically derived superpower. So it's kind of like a... I don't know, was it in Flashpoint a little while ago when DC did something similar to this? Where 6 characters, each of which yelled out one letter in Shazam, and they transformed collectively?
Yep.
That's right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Bill Parker originally had in mind something closer to that. Like a team of, like a little mini pantheon of mythically powered characters. But editorial director Ralph Day, who was in charge of, I think he kind of kept Captain Marvel on a more straight and narrow course in the early days. He convinced Bill Parker that this was maybe a little too unwieldy, got him to collapse the 6 characters down into a single character with 6 powers. And that is where the proto-Captain Marvel came into play. So it was Bill Parker who conceived the acronym of Shazam, which, as most of us, I'm sure, are aware, stands for the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury. Bill Parker came up with that all on his lonesome. And he also created Spy Smasher and Ibis the Invincible, Golden Arrow, Lance O'Casey, and the list goes on. The whole original slate of Whiz Comics was his doing. He wrote the whole content for the first issue, and he continued to write Captain Marvel for, about the first year of his existence.
That's impressive to me because, again, not as well versed in this history. I didn't realize it's just that one person who came up with all these concepts, at least in the written sense. That's very impressive.
Now, he delegated pretty soon afterwards, but yeah, he was. Yeah, Whiz Comics was kind of his baby from the start, although he passed it on.
And as you mentioned, Murd, I mean, you put it very well. Comics were just a-borning at this point. So these creators, many of whom were quite young. I don't know how old Bill Parker was, but they were kind of making this up as they went. And for him to step into that breach, and he was given this mandate, he just created the beginning of this whole universe from whole cloth. That's more impressive than some comic creators. Let's put it that way. So,
oh yeah, world builder to be sure. All right then. So where were we? All right. So Bill Parker conceived all of this stuff, and now might be a good time to point out that there was no such thing as Whiz Comics #1. Right. This is the series that originated Captain Marvel, just as Action Comics did Superman, but unlike Action Comics, which featured Superman in its first issue, Whiz Comics never had a first issue per se. Fawcett distributed limited quantities of black and white ash can, featuring its contents were basically the Captain Marvel origin story, as eventually seen in Whiz #2 in full comic book form, with a couple of changes. Well, for one thing, the character was originally called Captain Thunder. Which makes good sense given the fact that a mystic bolt of lightning is what facilitates the change between Billy Batson and Captain Marvel. But originally he was called Captain Thunder. And this story of his origin was distributed under a couple of different titles because Fawcett was they were doing this solely to establish the copyright on these titles. Originally they wanted to go with Flash Comics as the title for their flagship book, but DC had beaten them to that punch with Flash Comics #1 introducing the Flash, Hawkman, Johnny Thunder, and so forth. They had wanted to do Thrill Comics. That was that was their second choice, but Nedor had beaten them to that punch with Thrilling Comics. So instead, they ended up going with Whiz Comics, sort of a mild tip of the hat to Whiz Bang, which was the origin and wellspring of the Fawcett Publications empire, after all. And so that's ultimately what the anthology title was called. So then comes February 1940, when Whiz Comics #2 was finally published.
Actually, maybe we should explain in case someone doesn't know what an ash can actually is.
Okay, I'll leave that up to you, Chris.
Actually, you're better equipped than I am.
I'm not sure that I am, honestly.
Okay, well, I'll do my best then. Ash cans were always black and white, and I'm not sure if they were the full size of a regular comic book.
They usually weren't.
They usually weren't, right? That's what I thought. And they were often put out there. Often they had very limited print runs. I think you note here that Whiz Comics, the Ash Can, had a very limited print run.
Yep, just distributed promotionally.
And they would often be put out for copyright reasons. They wanted to seize the copyright on a certain title before they then fully developed it in a 4-color comic.
Right.
And I mean, there are people far better versed in the history of Ash Cans than I am, but some of them are highly collectible.
Oh yeah.
And again, they had very limited. I don't know what the number of print runs there was for Whiz Comics #1. I'm sure it wasn't that extensive. I'm sure someone in the forum could help us out with that. But getting your hands on some of these Ash Cans, I mean, that's a highly collectible and in many cases very valuable addition because again, they're often so limited. I honestly don't remember why they're called Ash Cans. I'm sure someone can help us out with that on the forums.
Because they were throwaways.
Okay, that would make sense.
That's my best guess.
Yeah, that would make sense though. Someone can help us with that. But
And there was somewhat a resurgence of them in the 90s through a couple comic book magazines that you could order Ash Cans of something coming up.
I remember that.
that's right. Yep.
And some of them were cool to have, but that didn't last long either.
Proceed, my friend.
Okay. So it was that Whiz Comics #2 was actually the first issue of that series and the first official appearance of Captain Marvel as such, because they decided to change the name from Thunder because it's a little too harsh sounding, a little too discordant. And besides, another possible explanation is that there was a character being published by a rival publisher called Fiction House. It's like an adventure strip called Captain Terry Thunder. So to avoid that legal hang-up. As to the origin of the Captain Marvel name, one anecdotal account has it that an artist named Pete Costanza, very important Fawcett figure, he was kind of like artist C.C. Beck's right-hand man. Legend has it that he proposed the name Captain Marvelous, and that was kind of workshopped a little bit around the office and shortened and softened down to Captain Marvel. So whether that's 100% true is lost to history, but it's the best we got. All right. And now a word or two perhaps is due to the artist, who is, I think, quite a few more people have heard of C.C. Beck.
Oh, yes.
The artist, the definitive Captain Marvel artist, than have heard of Bill Parker. But the C.C., resources tend to be a little bit confused as to whether they stand for Clarence Charles or Charles Clarence. In my youth, when I was first learning a little bit about Captain Marvel, I think I got a hold of one that had it as Clarence Charles, but I believe it's actually Charles Clarence Beck. He was from Minnesota originally. He had come on board with Fawcett Publications when they were still out in Robbinsdale, doing illustrations for their publications out there. And he kind of came east with them and became one of the very first staff artists at Fawcett Publications. He eventually grew in prominence and stature there at that company to the point where, they actually financed his establishment of his own art shop out in New Jersey, sorry. And they did that in lieu of a raise, the way he tells it anyway. Also in lieu of a raise, they allowed it, kind of similar to how Mel Blanc became the first cartoon voiceover actor to have his own voice characterizations credit on the shorts in which he participated. And he got that in place of a pay raise that Warner Brothers owed him. C.C. Beck got to be the only artist who was allowed to be credited for his work at Fawcett. They did not allow artists to sign their work.
Which was very common in the Golden Age.
Company policy. But C.C. Beck was the exception. And so he was kind of like the guy. And
now, when DC published the brief Shazam series in the 70s, didn't they bring Beck back to draw some of those?
He did.
Okay.
But C.C. Beck was a very, very strong-willed and strong-opinioned individual. He eventually he had his own column in the Comics Journal called Krusty Curmudgeon, CC. Yeah. So he kind of became famous for being opinionated and disagreeable, some of which may have just been like self-satire, perhaps. I don't know if he was really as crusty as he came off in his columns, but he sort of quarreled with DC editorial, and he didn't approve of the scripts that Denny O'Neil was turning in for the character. He thought the whole thing was poorly done, and so irreconcilable differences arose, and he left the project after 10 issues, I think. I'll know more for certain when we talk about Shazam and the Bronze Age. But yes, C.C. Beck was definitely involved in the 70s revival, albeit somewhat briefly. So, yes, C.C. Beck was on board here from the very start. It was he who developed the visual of Captain Marvel. So he designed the famous red and yellow costume that Cap wears, which we are told is actually it was always supposed to resemble a military uniform. C.C. Beck had done illustrations for a print adaptation of a comic opera called The Student Prince. It was composed by Sigmund Romberg and first performed in 1924. And apparently Beck was inspired by the costume design of the main character in that operetta when he came up with Cap's costume, with that shoulder cape. And originally it had that sort of a buttoned jacket flap in the front.
Kind of reminds you in some ways of sometimes when you see the uniforms of World War I fighter pilots, aces.
Yeah.
That I can see that comparison.
So that, and also that sort of loose sash around his, the yellow thing around its waist. It is actually described in a couple of stories as a sash rather than a belt. So he was thinking in terms of something other than your basic circus leotards, which was the inspiration for Superman's costume. But before we get into talking about the textual origin of Captain Marvel, I think we have to acknowledge the true origin of Captain Marvel, which was simply that Fawcett wanted a Superman knockoff. There's been much said about whether or not Captain Marvel deserves to be thought of as just a Superman knockoff. I think the answer of all of those present is that he was a lot more than that. But as far as Fawcett was concerned, that's all they really wanted this character to be. I think that's the main reason why Day had to pull Bill Parker back from his idea to make a 6-character team instead of just a single monomythic character. And they also had to pull C.C. Beck back a little bit and get him to retool his costume design to make it look a little bit more like your standard superhero, i.e. Superman, costume.
I think that can be the impetus that they wanted a Superman knockoff, but even just talking to you and looking at the first couple issues, it was just so much more than that, even right away, that I just can't see how that's a fair comparison anymore.
Yes, and that's quite a few employees or former employees of Fawcett Publications would agree with that, certainly, because C.C. Beck definitely wanted to do something more than just copy Superman.
Yeah,
and as this time passed and Captain Marvel's popularity grew, and C.C. Beck's influence in the company therefore grew, he was allowed to take Captain Marvel further and further away from being just something in the mold of Superman. But for the first year or two of stories, and here's a point where I can also address some people's criticisms that Captain Marvel is just kind of childlike and silly and sunny la-la and it's whimsy is a word that's often used to describe his Golden Age adventures, and perhaps deservedly so, but it's not quite the kind of whimsy that most people are envisioning, who have not experienced the stories for themselves. And certainly not in the very early going, when what we have here in these early Whiz comic stories is really fairly, as Shane said, it's recognizably distinct from a lot of other Golden Age comics on the racks, but it's still not as different from those other comics as you might think. I mean, it's just Golden Age action storytelling. There's blood and death and violence and all of that good stuff,
which is very typical of early Golden Age. Like
absolutely,
Batman, for example, and so forth.
Just adolescent, fierce.
Pre-code books.
Bloodlust and all of that. Yeah, but so Captain Marvel was a little bit more wholesome than some books on the shelves in those early days. But still...
think about like Submariner smashing people's heads and, drowning most of Manhattan and things of that nature.
Oh, yeah, Captain Marvel didn't quite do that. But the villains routinely died in his stories, which is another hallmark of Golden Age storytelling. So just put the idea out of your heads that Captain Marvel was just fluffy kid stuff from go. He was always a little bit more than that, but in the early going, he was a little more in line with the other things on the shelves in those days. All right, so now we get down to the published origin story of Captain Marvel, the world's mightiest man, powerful champion of justice, relentless enemy of evil. I think most of us have heard the story. It's we begin with Billy Batson. That's the sort of the reader's identification character. He's a homeless orphan, selling newspapers outside of the subway station where he sleeps at night because he has no place else to go. And a mysterious stranger in a dark trench coat and a high-peaked hat. It's an element of the Captain Marvel mythos that isn't really explored very thoroughly in the Golden Age, although Ordway has his own theory about this mysterious stranger. He leads Billy down a tunnel in this subway station where Billy himself has never visited. They climb on board an enchanted subway car marked with strange symbols and glyphs. The man reassures Billy everything has been arranged, and they take the car to an underground cavern. Billy and the stranger walk together through an entrance corridor decorated with a row of 7 statues, each representing a different one of the 7 deadly enemies of man.
That's a very famous panel, that whole image.
Mm-hmm. Labeled for your convenience. Really neat visualizations of each of those 7 deadly enemies by Beck. And it's here that Billy first encounters the old wizard Shazam. Sitting in his high-backed throne, there's a giant globe to one side of him, a giant book to the other, a lit brazier in the background, and a giant marble block hovering over his head, held up by a slender thread. And the wizard addresses Billy by name. Billy wonders how he knows his name, and the wizard speaks his name. He introduces himself as Shazam, and lightning crashes for the first time. This is the first of a very, 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 very long series of what would eventually be known around the Fawcett offices as boom panels, which were an art form in themselves. How many different times over the course of 13 or so years of Fawcett Comics and Captain Marvel comics did they have to illustrate that magic lightning bolt coming down and striking Billy and turning him into Captain Marvel? So, and how many different ways can you write little text captions describing what happens? So the writers sort of challenged themselves in different ways that they could keep doing that and make it interesting. The artist, meanwhile, just drew the little jagged lightning bolts and experimented with sound effects. And eventually, boom was kind of settled upon as the standard. But in the early going, we'd get things like blam, crash, wham, wango.
Wango.
That's my favorite. Yeah, but the very first one, when Shazam speaks his own name, it's crash. Then Shazam points to the explication of his name as an acronym on the wall behind him, tells Billy that he's been using these powers of the gods and the ancient elders to protect mankind for 3,000 years, but now his death is approaching, and he's chosen Billy to be his successor. Then Shazam activates the historama, which is like a magic screen on a wall nearby. We see Billy's early days. We see him being evicted from the home of his wicked uncle Ebenezer, not named Ebenezer in this story. In fact, this is the only time, this is the first and last time we'll see Billy's wicked uncle for a long while. Jerry Ordway, again, in The Power of Shazam, returns to him in the 90s and makes him an ongoing character. But here we just see Billy's uncle. Billy's parents have been killed, and Billy's uncle kicks him out in the street to get hold of Billy's inheritance. And that's how Billy ends up being a street orphan. So, and then as the thread suspending the block above Shazam's head frays down to its thinnest, he instructs Billy to... Well, he tells him his name is going to be Captain Marvel as soon as he acquires these powers. Then he tells Billy to speak my name. Billy says, Shazam! Blam! Down comes the lightning bolt, and he becomes Captain Marvel. There he stands with his button jacket flap and his waist sash, looking all Fred McMurray, because actor Fred McMurray was the visual inspiration.
See, I never knew that. I love Fred
I didn't
McMurray.
know that either.
One of my favorite all-time movies is The Apartment with Fred McMurray, Jack Lemmon, and Shirley MacLaine, where he plays a total cad, which is so he's going very much against type in terms of, father knows best and all that. He was father knows best, right?
Or
My Three Sons. My Three Sons,
Yeah. My Three Sons, yeah.
So that's a great bit of trivia I never knew about. Fantastic, Murdough.
Oh, sure. Yep. Well, Beck did that a lot with the characters he designed. It just kind of became like a running joke with Fawcett. Well, they published a lot of movie magazines, too. It was one of their other lines. And so Beck explained it a couple of different ways, depending on what mood he was in when he was being interviewed, I guess. But sometimes he said they went with the likenesses of well-known celebrities for some of their characters. And when we get to other characters who are based on well-known actors, I'll point them out. But they did that because it made the characters instantly relatable to the audience, instantly recognizable. But other times Beck just said that they were feeling a little insecure about their ability to create new characters and new faces. So they just went ahead and modeled them on celebrities that they'd been drawing for Fawcett celebrity magazines. So, thus it was that actor Fred McMurray became the inspiration for Cap. Those heavy black eyebrows, the wavy hairline.
And now that I look at it, you can clearly tell that it's based, and I never thought of it before, it's clearly based on Fred McMurray. Especially his brow, the eyebrows completely. Well done, Murd.
Okay, so Billy salutes his patron Shazam by saying, "Yes, sire." That word balloon has always stayed with me for some reason. As Shazam exhorts him to defend the poor and helpless, right wrongs, and crush evil everywhere. Then he tells Captain Marvel to say Shazam again. He does, and then the giant stone block collapses down onto the big block of granite. The Damoclean block crushes Shazam. But we haven't seen the last of him. For even though he's dead, he has become more powerful than we can possibly imagine. Billy will be able to summon Shazam for help and guidance in the future. He just needs to find his way back down to Shazam's death chamber and light the brazier. I always pronounce it. Yes, for women's liberation. No. Light the brazier. I always mispronounce that word. Brazier. Wonder what I'm thinking of. And Shazam's spirit will appear to guide.
That will go down as a priceless moment. Continue.
Thank God we have that recorded.
One may only hope. And then Billy Batson, human again, reemerges out of the subway and remarks, "Gee, it all seems like a dream." And the next day, he's back at work selling his papers, still wondering if he dreamed the whole thing. Happens to sell a newspaper with a headline about a maniac scientist who's holding the U.S. radio industry for ransom.
Of course.
Unless they pay him $50 million, he will use his diabolical radio silencer invention.
Hey, he was more realistic than Dr. Evil's demand for a ransom.
100 billion.
Dollars.
Sorry, couldn't help it.
And a couple of toughs buy a paper from him, and one of them remarks, "Hey, you want to read about the boss, eh?" And so Billy has lucked into a lead as to the whereabouts of this maniac scientist. So he trails these two...
That was a great boy chick type voice, by the way, but go ahead. Joe Palooka. Anyway.
Surely talk amongst yourselves. Well, Joe Palooka, that's good for the period. Yeah. So Billy trails these two toughs through the city, and at this point we still don't know exactly what city it is. You know, I've read through 1945 that's what this episode's covering, by the way, if we haven't mentioned it before, 1940 through 1945. The city, they haven't committed to a city yet. There are a couple of stories that make it fairly obvious that the creators were thinking in terms of New York, but nobody has called it Fawcett City just yet. I'm not sure exactly when that term came into use, but it was sometime between the 40s and the 80s. Because Who's Who in the DC Universe gives their base of the Marvel characters' base of operations as Fawcett City. So Ordway did not come up with that himself. That was in place before that.
And Murd's bound tome of Who's Who is always reassuringly right next to his computer on our table.
It kind of reminds me of that giant book that's leaning on Shazam's throne, actually. Just hope there's not a granite block above my head. Okay, so anyway, Billy trails these two gunsels to an apartment building. It's the Sky Tower Apartments. But he's denied admittance. So... logically, instead of going to the police with this story, he heads directly to the offices of the Amalgamated Broadcasting Company and its flagship station, Radio Whiz, W-H-I-Z. It's there that he meets for the first time a major supporting character in the Captain Marvel mythos, Sterling Morris. He is the president of Whiz Radio. He eventually will become Billy's boss. He is kind of like Billy's own version of Perry White. White-haired, portly gentleman, reflective glasses, a white mustache. Like Perry White, except, wider-bodied and maybe not quite as intelligent, or at least not quite as aware of child endangerment laws, because he hires Billy on as a cub radio reporter and sends him off on all kinds of dangerous situations. And well, anyway, in this first appearance, though, he rebuffs Billy. He doesn't believe a word that Billy has a lead on the scientist who's holding radio for ransom. But Billy says, okay, if I can prove to you that if I can bring down this scientist, will you give me a job as a radio announcer? And Sterling Morris says, yeah, I'll give you anything you want if you can find this man. Now get out of here, kid. You bother me. So Billy then makes his way back to the apartment building, says Shazam, and makes a mighty leap between the top of the neighboring building and the apartment building where where the hoodlums he's following went in. So we can glean from this that Captain Marvel in this appearance does not yet have the ability to fly.
Okay.
So like Superman, he had to sort of evolve that
that's
power over
know
time.
That. Okay.
Yeah. So he jumps over there. He finds the two hoods talking to their employer, their master, via a complicated vidscreen device. And there we get our first glimpse of Captain Marvel's recurring nemesis, Dr. Sivana, mad scientist of destruction. More often called Sivana than Dr. Sivana in the early stories, because I guess they figured they didn't want to accord such a title of respect to such a despicable character. But anyway, he's this gnarled, gnomish, bald-haired, floppy-eared, buck-toothed little jerk. And this first issue is really the closest thing we get to a straight portrayal of Sivana, because he was kind of, I think Beck, who always had a strong sense of the ridiculous, sort of influenced the portrayal of Sivana as kind of silly. Sort of the ultimate caricature of the mad scientist stock character that was already becoming well-known across entertainment media, comics and beyond. But here he's played fairly seriously. We see him for only 2 panels in this story, but we've learned that he is the one behind this plot to use his radio silencer to eliminate radio forever. And imagine the horror that would inspire in children of those days, since radio was their most reliable source of entertainment. So Captain Marvel jumps in, beats up the hoods, smashes the machine. And he's not able to confront Sivana directly because Sivana's not actually present. He just talks to him through the vid screen. He says, "Well, Sivana, that's the end of your radio silencer, but not the end of me. We will meet again, Captain Marvel." "Yes, Sivana, we will meet again. And when we do, you will be behind prison bars or dead." And he dramatically smashes the screen. No holy molies here. This is... So, and then he strikes a jaunty pose and says, "Well, I guess that ought to hold our friend Sivana for a while. And now," and he says the magic word again, big old boom happens, and he becomes Billy Batson once more. He puts in a call to Sterling Morris, who comes right over to the apartment building, naturally, because he has nothing else going on. And
this kid just called? Let me race right over.
I'll get my hat. And Billy displays the evidence, the smashed radio silencer. That's apparently enough to convince Sterling Morris, who, as I've mentioned, is not necessarily that bright. C.C. Beck himself had that opinion of Mr. Morris, whom he based on character actor Gene Lockhart, by the way.
Okay, all right.
So another character based on a famous actor's likeness. So then, Sterling Morris is only too willing to give Billy his coveted job as radio reporter. And so the next time on the very last page, it says, "Don't fail to be on hand next month when when Billy and Captain Marvel go to town." So there you go. There's the first appearance of Captain Marvel.
One interesting thing I've just noted as I'm looking at the first issue over your shoulder there is, it's a testament to how enduring Captain Marvel's costume design is. They've really never changed it, right? Isn't it essentially been the same costume?
Pretty close to
entire
it.
history.
Small details.
I think it's a great design.
I mean, within recent years, especially, I think it's changed more in the last decade than it had for 60 years.
Because even in the 80s, Shane, it was still the same costume, wasn't it?
For the most part, yeah.
And I love the distinctive black knitted surface on the boots.
Seam on the front of the boots.
It's just a great touch. It's so distinctive.
And some of the facial features have come and gone, but he seems to always return back to that kind of look and likeness with the bussier eyebrows at some point.
Yeah. Different things have been done with these little knit loops on the back of his cape.
Yeah.
Beck is never satisfied with the way, was never satisfied. C.C. Beck died in 1989, but he always complained that some people drew those little loops to look like flowers, other people made them look like propellers, He also complained about those armbands at his sleeve, at the cuff of his sleeve. Those are actually meant to be bands of rank.
Oh, okay.
Just distinguishing him as a captain, as opposed to like wristlets or anything like that.
Fascinating.
And we've already mentioned the jacket flap went away after a few issues.
That's true.
Ordway brought that back in the 90s.
Okay. Well, it's such a great look. I mean,
completely agree.
That again, like a World War I ace, like a 1930s, like pulp hero.
I mean, even Star Trek in the movies used that.
That's true. Yeah.
I always enjoyed that.
Almost like a naval uniform in that sense.
And before we move past Whiz Comics number 2, and I promise we won't spend as much time on other stories after this, but this is...
come on, this is his first appearance. Yeah.
This is the embryo of everything that Captain Marvel would become. We have to devote the attention to it. But the cover is, just as Superman is seen hoisting a car above his head on the cover of Action number 1. Captain Marvel does him one better and picks up a gangster's car and throws it against a wall on the cover of his first appearance. And you don't see it here on this Millennium Edition reprint that I'm holding, but the cover tagline was "Gangway for Captain Marvel."
And what's great about that, if you extrapolate, you think, all right, there's no way those gangsters survived that because... Like, it's kind of off-panel. Watching that guy's head went right against that brick wall.
It's very A-teamish.
I love the early Golden Age.
Yes. If bad people die, it doesn't count. That's kind of the rule. Okay, so moving on to Whiz Comics number 3. And here's where things get even more complicated. Even though there was no such thing as Whiz Comics number 1, there were 2 Whiz Comics number 3s.
Oh, that I did not know.
One assumes that they did that to even out the numbering, so that from issue number 4 on, every issue number would be more or less correct Issue number 2 was actually the first issue, but then there were 2 number 3s, and issue number 4 was really the fourth issue published. So we'll call them issues 3A and 3B. Issue 3A was from cover dated March 1940. It was a monthly series from the start. Sivana is back right away. He was in most of Captain Marvel's stories in the early going. He declares open war on the United States. Okay,
Of course.
And he apparently commands a pretty sizable private army, all kinds of fancy tanks and planes and munitions factory and all that sort of thing. And Captain Marvel has a lot of fun smashing all of these things in the course of this second Captain Marvel story. And we're also introduced in the first couple of pages to Billy as boy reporter running around. For the first couple of years of Captain Marvel stories, almost every single Cap story began with Billy Batson as framing device. He's on the microphone and he's saying, "Folks, here's something that happened to Captain Marvel recently. Wait till you hear it." And even more stories ended with Billy addressing his listeners. That he always called them folks.
Murr, that was a great 1940s radio voice, by the way.
Now,
Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Fawcett and all the ships at sea.
now, after his first encounter in that issue number 2, where it's kind of dream-like, did they ever return to that, or he just kind of remembers everything that happened?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt in his mind after he finally uses his Cap powers to beat up Sivana's men that it really happened, and Shazam was real and all of that. Okay, so back to issue 3A. Sivana is on the march. Captain Marvel, it's just a lot of action of him beating up Sivana's henchmen. In these early stories, he's not quite as invulnerable as he would later be. He can still be subdued and bound, and he's vulnerable to poison gas. Actually, quite a few costumed mystery men who were otherwise invulnerable had their need to breathe exploited as a weakness.
And we have to think about how poison gas is a concept on people's minds because of its huge impact on World War I. So it makes sense it would be used as a plot device.
Yeah. So that is how Sivana occasionally overpowers Captain Marvel within like the first year of stories. So he ties up Captain Marvel, leaves him in a room with an atom smasher machine of some kind, and Captain Marvel is, of course, able to break free. This is the first, by the way, face-to-face encounter between Marvel and Sivana, and it's the first time Sivana used his trademark chuckle. So, but Marvel breaks free and causes the Atom Smasher machine to explode ahead of schedule, and it appears that Sivana is hoist with his own petard, but you know what certain Golden Age villains are like. Some of them are doomed to die in their first appearance, most of them, in fact, but some of them are just harder to kill than cockroaches, and Sivana is definitely in the latter category, and he seems to be dead in this first appearance, but he definitely is not. Then, in next month, the second Whiz Comics number 3. It's the introduction of the planet Venus as a setting, which was revisited by the Marvel family and even more so the Sivana family over the years. Dr. Sivana often used it as a hideout. Billy Batson is assigned by Sterling Morris to go interview a scientist who is planning a rocket launch to Venus. Billy shows up at the scientist's house. The door opens, and it's this bald-headed, bespectacled face, already familiar to Whiz readers who've been read the first couple of issues, with a big face full of false whiskers. He's supposed to be named Professor Xerxes Smith, but it's really Sivana in disguise. So here we are. It's only his third appearance, and already he's resorting to Looney Tunes tactics. He loved cheesy disguises, did Sivana. So for unguessable reasons, Xerxes Smith agrees to take Billy Batson, this young boy reporter, into space with him, and they land on the planet Venus, which is envisioned by C.C. Beck and the Fawcett creators as this lush jungle world inhabited by intelligent frog creatures called glompers, I think, and all kinds of monsters.
Sure,
of
why
course.
not?
Crazy, dragon-like C.C. Beck-drawn monsters. And it's there that Xerxes Smith reveals himself as Sivana, and Billy Batson, I think to combat one of the monsters there, says Shazam and changes himself into Captain Marvel to fight it, and Sivana is standing right there. And so there we are, third meeting between these characters, and already Sivana knows that Billy Batson and Captain Marvel are one and the same.
Boy, they didn't wait long to pull that one off.
No, they did not. Yeah. And the funny thing is, he's one of the few characters who gains that knowledge and retains it throughout the whole run of the characters' relationship. He's too wicked and selfish to tell anybody else that this is the truth. Well, he does occasionally to his henchmen, but they usually don't survive till the end of the story to tell anybody about it. So there you go. He knows Billy's secret from go, almost.
But I love the fact that he's so egomaniacal, he feels that he has to jealously guard the fact that only he knows the secret.
Exactly. eventually there will be a story where we see a little more insight into his pride as a villain. But so anyway, he gets the better of Billy once he transforms back into Billy, and he's brought before the Empress of Venus, or a character who's introduced as the Empress of Venus. We'll later learn that that's actually a bit of a pose, but her name is Beautia, the Empress of Venus, whose sinister beauty affects men like a powerful drug.
Now, does she look humanoid?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
She is 100% human, because she is human. She's not even a native of Venus.
Okay.
She is a human being, and she was based by C.C. Beck on Betty Grable.
Okay.
And she's kind of like Miss... She is to Savannah what Miss Teschmacher was to the movie Lex Luthor.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, she's sort of like an on-again, off-again accomplice.
Miss Teschmacher!
Not always a willing accomplice. She develops a pretty powerful crush on Captain Marvel almost right away. Billy becomes Captain Marvel in front of her, and she tries to seduce him, and he'll have none of it, although women, as we'll see, will turn out to be Billy's Achilles' heel in a lot of future stories.
Now-
Wait. Captain Marvel's
Okay,
Achilles
because
heel.
Billy's a kid.
Yes, and Captain Marvel is not much less a kid than he is.
Right, I know mentally he's but is she trying to seduce Billy or Captain Marvel?
Captain Marvel.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I wasn't sure in what form
want
he
to
was
clarify that.
when Savannah brought him
Yeah.
/ them before Beautia.
Now, is
I'm sorry,
Savannah
Shane.
enamored with Beautia?
No.
Okay.
That's a definite no, and the answer to that is coming up.
All right.
So, I've always known that Captain Marvel's persona is somewhat childlike. Is that fair to say?
I think so,
Kind
yes.
of wide-eyed, essentially.
He has a certain naivete about him, and his moral code is so black and white.
And does that ever really change, or have they kind of always stuck with that persona?
Well, in later years, in the 90s, Captain Marvel and Billy Batson had pretty much exactly the same psyche, no matter what body he was wearing. In the 40s, they seemed, in some stories, they were very overtly portrayed as two separate people, two separate mentalities and personalities. There's been a lot of debate, actually, over old-timey Captain Marvel fans, over whether or not they deserve, whether Billy just becomes Captain Marvel, or if Billy is somehow shunted off into limbo, and Captain Marvel appears to take his place. Frank Miller actually subscribed to the latter theory, because in The Dark Knight Strikes Again...
I haven't read that in years.
Yeah, I just read it recently.
Yeah.
So Captain Marvel is in there, and when he says Shazam near the end of the story, he reveals to Wonder Woman, just before he does, that Billy Batson actually died years ago. And when Captain Marvel says his word one last time, there will be no one left there to say Shazam again to bring him back. So he'll basically be canceling himself out of existence.
Huh.
That's Frank Miller's take on it.
Interesting. Okay.
And that's far, far in the future for us here. We're still in 1940. These existential dilemmas are far from the minds of the creators or readers of Captain Marvel. At this point, he's just a 10-year-old kid who can turn himself into a superpowered adult. But yeah, Billy and Cap are equally uncomfortable around beautiful women, though. That's established fairly early on. He's able to resist Queen Beautia's charms here, though. She casts him in the dungeon. Eventually, she and Savannah get on board a rocket ship and head back to Earth. Captain Marvel breaks free, of course, has to defeat a big, ugly monster to do so, and he figures out the equation, using the wisdom of Solomon, that Savannah had used to construct his rocket. He puts together a rocket of his own, follows them back to Earth, and he discovers that the first thing that Savannah and Beauty have done upon returning to Earth is enter a beauty pageant. Which Beauty, I guess it's just sort of self-promotion for the scheme that they have in mind for Whiz Comics number 4.
God, I love this stuff. Ugh.
So, anyway, Billy is able to... So they enter the beauty contest, and Savannah has some kind of backup plan in mind where he was going to paralyze people or something. But Captain Marvel thwarts that pretty readily. But Billy and Savannah and Beauty manage to escape. Then in Whiz Comics number 4... they're back, and Beautia is now running for president. Since this was happening in 1940, which was, after all, an election year. And I guess they were trading on her notoriety from winning that beauty pageant.
I think that was that Roosevelt against Wendell Willkie, 1940? I know you'd appreciate that.
This is real-world history. You know? I'm here to talk about Earth S history. So
I love on Earth S, a woman can actually run for president in 1940. They were very modern and far-thinking in that
Absolutely fantastic. It's also a world where there are monsters on Venus.
Right.
So anyway, Beautia does not quite win. Captain Marvel busts up their campaign headquarters before their campaign can get too far off the ground. But Savannah is able to overpower him as Billy Batson, straps him into a sort of mind-wiping device that disorients him, gives him a case of temporary amnesia, one of many such cases of amnesia that Billy will get over the years, so that he not only can't remember his magic word, but he can't remember who he is or who he could be if he said Shazam. So in this daze, Billy somehow gets himself loose from his confinement, stumbles away from the mind control device, gets underground somehow, and blunders into Shazam's cavern. This is his first return visit to the cavern since his origin in Wiz number 3. And there he happens to read the word Shazam spelled out on the wall, becomes Captain Marvel, his memories instantly returned. Transformation into Captain Marvel tends to heal whatever is ailing Billy. If he's been poisoned or drugged or injured or whatever, he turns into Captain Marvel. He can then turn right back to himself fully healed.
And Billy, you said, is 10 years old, correct? Or is that not established?
It was his exact age was never precisely established.
Okay.
It was one of the dicta that was handed out to Fawcett writers. I've actually got a copy in the Fawcett Companion.
Which makes
here.
sense because they can give it a timeless quality, essentially.
Yeah, well, the idea was they wanted any readers of any age to be able to identify with Billy. They wanted Billy to be whatever age the reader wanted Billy to be, whether that means the same age as the reader or older or younger or what have you. But the writers were instructed in the little sort of character Bible that executive editor Will Lieberson eventually put together, which is reproduced in here. There's the rule of thumb they're supposed to use is that he was about 12 when he first got his powers, which means that in Wiz number 4 he's still 12, and then he probably shouldn't be treated as ever getting any older than 14 or so. So they were told to imagine that they were just writing for a 14-year-old boy, even though his actual age might be something else. And since Billy is an orphan and no records exist, we're later told, of his precise birth. He doesn't know what his birth date is. He doesn't even know how old he is. But I've always kind of assumed, and perhaps Jerry Ordway's Power of Shazam series influenced me a little bit in this, that when Captain Marvel Jr. is introduced a few years later on down the line, he's actually a little bit older than Captain Marvel Sr. That's definitely the way it was in the Power of Shazam series, and it works for me. So anyway, short answer is he's 12 at this point.
Fair enough.
All right, and so he gets his memory back, and he goes back and defeats Sivana, loads him and Beauty on board a one-way rocket back to Venus. But Sivana manages to parachute off the rocket, and he's still around to cause trouble, whereas Beauty has been sent back to her planet and her people, where she can resume her role as Empress. Okay, Wiz number 5 is the first issue without Captain Sivana. Captain Marvel goes up against a man named Dr. Aloysius Lake, who is a scientist who has distributed brainwashing machines to these franchised Fagans in cities throughout the U.S. So these Fagans can then use these machines to brainwash street kids into stealing for them. And Billy and Cap trace all of this back to the West Coast, where Lake is headquartered, and smash his operation. So there's your story for Wiz number 5. Wiz number 6 is Cap's first experience with a circus. Fairly common setting for Golden Age stories. And since Captain Marvel's so old-timey and Americana, you'd see lots of circus and carnival settings in future issues. But this is the first time Cap or Billy visited a circus. Trouble at the Circus of Death. With a background, there's a background character called Clarence the Maniac Man, which is one assumes is C.C. Beck, Charles Clarence Beck, poking a little fun at himself. Yeah, whenever possible, he and his assistants and fellow artists would draw in little cameos by other members of the Fawcett creative
I always
staff.
love when the comic creators would do stuff like that. It just shows they're putting more of their heart and soul into what they're doing.
Oh,
so
yes.
Fun.
Yeah, I was
Quite literally.
picking that out too.
Let's see. So Wiz Comics number 7. For what I assume might be copyright reasons, I don't even remember what happened in this story, but Billy began wearing red sweaters. And did you guys notice I'm dressed as Billy Batson tonight?
You are indeed, sir.
You are. No, I didn't
My
notice that.
generic red pullover with a yellow undershirt. So
Well done.
this is my London Super Comic Con staff shirt. This yellow thing under here. So yeah, holy moly. So Cap started. No, it's not Cap, but Billy. Billy began appearing with his trademark red sweater, but with large yellow capital B's on the front. Sometimes one B, sometimes two, depending on who was drawing it. I assume they might have tried doing that to make Billy as easily trademarkable as visually as Captain Marvel himself was. And that didn't last all that long. Billy went back to his plain red sweaters. The same month as Wiz number 7 hit shelves. By this time, Captain Marvel had been around for 8 months, approximately, give or take. And it became clear to the Fawcett people that he was a hit. So they kind of scrambled to put together some additional Captain Marvel content for a little bit of cash grab. So they put together a one-shot comic called Special Edition Comics. It was published in August of 1940. And it was the first comic book ever published that contained nothing but stories about Captain Marvel. It was far from the last, of course. It was a whole issue with 4 stories, all Captain Marvel stories, all written by Bill Parker and illustrated by C.C. Beck and friends. Beck eventually had somewhere between like 15 and 20 assistants working for him at his shop. The most stalwart among them were Pete Costanza, who, as I mentioned, suggested Captain Marvelous as a name for the... And also Marcus D. Swayze, talented artist who was responsible for creating the look of Mary Marvel.
Well, he becomes a major Fawcett artist, doesn't he?
Yes,
Swayze? Yeah.
yes. He drew the lion's share of their Captain Midnight stories, I believe, eventually. But he was also very influential in Captain Marvel. So anyway, these 4 stories in Special Edition Comics #1, so this one-shot was called. Well, it's Captain. A couple of them are fairly forgettable Cap versus Racketeer stories, but he also goes up against Dr. Alarog, his first encounter with a gorilla, because gorillas sell comics, as we all know.
Of course.
And Dr. Alarog is a super-powered gorilla, which is even better. And there's also another Venus story. Captain Marvel goes on a trip to Venus and comes up afoul against Sivana up there. Butia is becoming more and more sympathetic towards Captain Marvel. She's really crushing on him hard, and she actually prevents Sivana from harming him. So there you go. So Sivana is very clearly established as the arch nemesis at this point, and Butia is going to be kind of the closest thing to love interest that the Cap's going to have.
A femme fatale, one could say as well, right?
That was kind of what she seemed at first, but afterwards she was established as too big-hearted and sympathetic. She's not really evil. She ultimately betrays Sivana altogether and just comes over to Captain Marvel's side. Although she's usually seen in stories that involve Sivana for reasons that will become clear a little later on. All right, Whiz Comics #8. I have that in my notes described as The System of Captain Death and Professor Skull. Professor Skull is a college professor whose field is kind of left unclear, some kind of super science. And Captain Death is a sea pirate. And their scam is they capture people who appear to have been drowned at sea, and Captain Death holds them prisoner, and Professor Skull then contacts these seemingly deceased people's relatives, and for exorbitant fees conjures the spirits of these drowned loved ones who are actually being held captive offshore, and there's some kind of television feed that's projecting their image. And so Captain Marvel comes in and busts this whole
I love how needlessly elaborate that whole scheme is.
Yeah, they must have been buddies at college.
Golden Age! All right. Whiz Comics #9 has Cap facing a mad scientist. He comes up across a lot of crackpot inventors and scientists throughout his
Seems to be
entire
their
Golden Age
go-to
run.
villain archetype at this, at this
and
period.
not only villains, but just plot facilitators.
Yeah.
You know, a large percentage of them are actually benign, and they just have inventions that get out of hand. So I think they're
Darn that death ray.
just as often nice crackpot scientists as evil ones. But this one is definitely a bad one that Cap meets in Whiz #9. He's a mad shrinker. He's got a shrink ray. And he intended it to be a teleportation device, but he discovered it made everything smaller when it came out to the other side. I'm wondering if maybe this story was Roald Dahl's inspiration for Mike TV and what happened to him in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh, God, that's
nice,
right.
nice.
All right, jump ahead. And we're not going to talk about every single story in Marvel between 1940 and 45. We'll be here all night. But
I'm enjoying this thoroughly, though, Murd, I must say.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
I mean, we could. It's just going to be multiple parts.
Yeah, well, we're already doing this in 2 parts because don't worry, we'll cover 1946 through 53 in a future episode, folks. But right now, so Whiz #11, skipping over Whiz #10 because I didn't think it was interesting. Billy goes.
Consigned to the ash heap of history. Go ahead.
Okay, so Billy Batson goes undercover at a college conveniently called Marvel College, where screwy goings-on are happening with the football team, which has not lost a game in a couple of years. But Sterling Morris has somehow become suspicious that something funny is going on over there, so he dispatches Billy to go undercover as a student, even though he's only like 12 or 13 years old at this point. Here we see Billy doing something unusual with his Shazam powers. He says Shazam, but he doesn't transform into Captain Marvel. Instead, sort of like a ghostly spectral afterimage of Captain Marvel appears behind him, whispers into his ear the answers he needs to pass the entrance exam to get into Marvel College. Now, overlooking for a moment the dubious ethics of this.
I was going to say, he cheated.
Yeah, so that's not exactly Captain Marvel's way. But of course, Billy's not really planning to enter this college to get a degree.
True,
He's just
that's true,
pretending to enroll so that he can see what's happening with the football team. But still, it's the first time when Captain Marvel... Well, for one thing, Billy says Shazam and doesn't change. For another, Captain Marvel appears as a separate being from Billy. So here we are. This is the first food for the Billy and Cap as separate people limbo theory. Since Cap just kind of appears and helps Billy cheat instead of Billy becoming him. Okay, and then Captain Marvel ends up signing up for the football team and playing football and beating everybody. And he replaces a player named Costanza, which is a caricature of Pete Costanza, an example of C.C. Beck drawing members of the Fawcett staff into the stories. All right, now this and issue number 12, I mean. Captain Marvel appears without a cape. That makes some sense in the story in number 11 because he's wearing a football uniform for most of his time as Captain Marvel. Issue number 12, though, he doesn't have the cape either. And I've read that the reason for this is that Fawcett was a little bit nervous, perhaps, about their character, Captain Marvel, becoming too similar.
And what's a shame about all that, because we know what's going to happen eventually, is just from reading Captain Marvel a little bit, or especially after going through this, there is no similarity really at all between Superman and Captain Marvel. Their origins,
black-haired muscle men who wear capes.
Yeah, I mean, but when you look at the two characters, they're so different. I mean, the tone, everything is. I mean, do you agree? I mean, they're such different characters, and shame on you, DC.
Yeah,
God, it's.
Yeah, and this isn't even the first time that wasn't the first time that Fawcett and DC had locked horns legally. Yeah. I think that's probably why Fawcett tried removing Captain Marvel's cape for a couple of months.
Well, I can understand that.
Just for fear that...
It's ridiculous.
See, they had already lost it. DC had complained about another character that Fawcett was publishing. Okay, there was a Fawcett series called Master Comics.
I've heard of that, yeah.
It was kind of an experimental thing at first. It was oversized. It was like 10 and a half by 14 inches. And the lead feature in that was a character called Master Man. And he did not have very much personality, and he was... We were talking about how Captain Marvel is distinct enough from Superman that they shouldn't be considered, just one a doppelganger of the other.
Right.
Master Man was more obviously just a swipe of Superman. And DC rattled their saber a little bit at Fawcett, and Fawcett decided... The strip had no personality, as I said. It wasn't doing very well. So Fawcett just said, what the heck, we'll pick our battles. We're not going to fight this. So they axed Master Man completely. In fact, they did kind of a scorch and burn thing and eliminated all the features in Master Comics. Brought in they folded in features from other series they were publishing, Slam Bang Comics and Nickel Comics. Thus, Bullet Man became the new lead character of Master Comics, as we will see. And Master Man disappeared completely. So this may be perhaps why Fawcett was feeling a little bit gun-shy here and removed Captain Marvel's cape for 2 issues. Anyway, as to what the capeless Captain Marvel actually did in issue number 12, he had his first run-in with European aggression. It's Nazis, yes, which were ubiquitous in Golden Age comics. But at this point, we weren't officially, United States was not officially embroiled in this conflict. So Fawcett, again, being kind of cautious and hedging bets, they didn't refer to these antagonists as Nazis. As you just said, Chris, they called them Nazis. G-N-A-T-Z-I-S.
We have to remember that by 1940, we're involved in the Lend-Lease program for Britain. So we're all but involved in World War II. We're not officially declaring war or in an official shooting war, but our sympathies are not secret by any stretch of the imagination. Hence, Captain America 1 came out before Pearl Harbor. You guys did the spotlight on Cap in the Golden Age, so we're clearly moving towards that point historically here.
And this is the first of many times that Captain Marvel would get involved in that scrap.
Do they use Captain Marvel for war bond drives and stuff like that?
Oh, extensively.
I figured, okay.
Oh, my God. Every single... I read a lot of Captain Marvel Golden Age comics, and every single one of them has multiple adverts and promotions for purchase of war bonds and stamps. But not just yet, because, after all, we're not at war. Right. So there's Marvel's first clash with the Nazis. Okay, Wiz Comics number 13.
Wait, I'm sorry, Murdough. One question. You say Billy disguised in blackface?
Oh, yes, that's in my notes, too. Yeah, he sneaks on board a Nazi cruiser by just rubbing engine grease on his face and introducing himself as Rastus Brown from Alabama.
Ah, the 40s.
Good
old-fashioned racism, U.S. of A., ladies and gentlemen.
It gets worse, Chris. Wait till you meet Steamboat.
Steamboat.
Yeah. Who basically really was the kind of minstrel show caricature
Yeah.
that Billy was pretending to be
Yes.
in this story. Okay, so Wiz number 13 is another Savannah story. He's got a scheme to poison water supplies with a youth tonic he's developed that turns everyone into children. That blows up in his face, of course, and for the first time, Billy is able to bring Savannah to justice. His first arrest. And that carries over into Wiz number 14. You know, just you hear it said so often that continuity in comics is a recent invention and that didn't happen so much.
Clearly
in the
not
Golden
here.
Age.
That's impressive. I didn't know that. Yeah.
It's a lot less tight in the Golden Age than it was nowadays, but fairly often, actually. One story leads directly or indirectly into another.
Which the other companies were not really doing in comparison to this, correct?
Fawcett was fairly innovative, yeah.
That's interesting.
Different storytelling strategies and formats of publication. The aforementioned oversized Master Comics being one example. Okay, so anyway, issue number 14 of Wiz is the trial of Savannah, in which we are told that his full name is Thaddeus Bodog Savannah. That has remained canon to this very day.
It's tremendous.
Although they don't really dwell on it too much in the comics. He's just Savannah most of the time. But in court, they had to address him formally. He's tried and convicted, and he is sentenced to 77 life terms in prison, which amounts to something like 9,000 years. But instead of getting distraught, Savannah simply grins and, muttering a mathematical formula he just perfected earlier that day, he turns intangible and walks through the wall of the courtroom. And the rest of the issue is a madcap chase as Captain Marvel tries to chase down this intangible foe. Eventually, though, he uses the wisdom of Solomon to work out the same equation, uses it to get himself out of a scrape or two in future issues of Wiz Comics, in fact. So it's kind of like he and Savannah each gain a new superpower in this story. But finally, Savannah kind of overtaxes his ability to phase through walls and apparently disintegrates altogether. And Butia, his sometime right-hand woman, is on hand when this happens, and she collapses and weeps, and Captain Marvel is kind of curious as to why she's so distraught over the loss of this horrible little man, and she kind of treats it like this horrible dark secret she doesn't want to explain to him. So there's a little bit of a cliffhanger there. I just noticed something that I forgot to mention about Wiz Comics issues number 11 and 12. Talking about this brewing legal conflict between DC National and Captain Marvel over the similarities between Superman and Captain Marvel. There's actually an advertisement in Wiz number 11
I
for
noted that, yeah.
Superman merchandise. Meanwhile, Captain Marvel is I forgot to include it in my notes, but fairly early on, issue number 4, there was an ad for what may be the first piece of Captain Marvel tie-in merchandise offered, and Fawcett was 100% aware of the marketing possibilities of a character like Captain Marvel.
In fact, and
they'd seen it in Superman.
I forgot to bring, and I'll bring it when we do the next installment of this series. I have a book in my inventory. I forgot the exact name of it. It's a beautiful hardcover.
Is it Chip Kidd?
Yes, it's Chip Kidd designed
All
it.
right.
It's all about the history, not only of Captain Marvel, but of his merchandise.
Right.
It is a fat tome. I mean, the amount of merchandise they produced. It's just an example of how he was on the level of Superman when it came to his accessibility in pop culture and so forth. It's a really great book.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing up that book, Chris.
I'll bring it next time.
Wasn't able to find a copy. It doesn't reproduce a whole lot of Captain Marvel comics.
No, there's a little bit. It's more just the merchandising they're focusing on. It's interesting.
Right. And what may be the first piece of that merchandise was something called a Captain Marvel Power Siren. There was a little ad for that in Wiz number 4. Okay, so jumping back in here to Wiz number 15. Very important issue because we learn the origin of Savannah. Turns out that back in the late 19th century, when Savannah was a young man in Europe, he was actually a benevolent scientist and an inspired inventor, kept coming up with devices and inventions and gewgaws that would make life better for human beings on Earth. But whenever he would try to sell these gimmicks to people who might mass produce them and make the world a better place, he realized that these captains of industry stood to lose a lot of money as a result of these incredible innovations that Savannah kept coming up with, and they ended up silencing him, mocking him, driving him out of country after country. So he wanted to do good, but he was thwarted by human greed and short-sightedness at every turn until finally something in him snapped, and he became a wicked old man. And he had managed to produce 2 beautiful little children somewhere along the way, and So finally, when he'd had enough of the human race, he built a rocket ship and went away to Venus.
They don't reveal who his wife was, though?
No.
Okay.
It is not mentioned at all. I'm not sure it ever really is mentioned in the Golden Age
Or
at
the
any
mother of
point.
his children.
Yeah. Jerry Ordway filled in that blank.
Okay.
He was so good at doing that in his Power of Shazam series in the 90s, he determined that her name was Venus. Fitting. A woman named Venus, and she was beautiful, as were her children, because goodness knows they didn't get their looks from their dad. So Sivana runs away to Venus, raises his 2 children there, and guess who one of them is?
Oh, it's Beautia, right?
Beautia, yeah. She's not really the Empress of Venus at all. She's been Sivana's daughter this whole time. Although, this was something the writers didn't really figure out until later, so there were a lot of early stories where Sivana kind of forgot that Beautia was his daughter and punished her very harshly, almost lethally, for siding with Captain Marvel over him. But anyway, here Beautia is telling the whole life story of Sivana to Captain Marvel so that he'll understand. And then the 2 of them, they try to track down Sivana, who has rematerialized. He clearly didn't die at the end of issue number 14. And he's getting on board a rocket ship trying to make his escape to Venus. Captain Marvel stops him, ends up locked in combat with a well, not really superhumanly, but nigh superhumanly strong Adonis of a young man named Magnificus. And it turns out that he is Beautia's brother and therefore Sivana's son. This is his only appearance for a very long time, Magnificus. But he and Beauty are both the members of the Sivana family, as they'll eventually be collectively known. Eventually, Marvel and Magnificus work out their differences, and Magnificus and Beauty talk Captain Marvel into allowing him to take their father into their custody, and they go off together to Venus. And Sivana is not seen in the strip again for a little while. All right, and now, coming into 1941, the second year of Captain Marvel's existence, we see the publication of something called 64 Pages of New Captain Marvel Adventures #1. Kind of a clunky title, but it's the second comic book ever published that was all Captain Marvel content. As the title tells you, it's 64 pages of it, 4 stories, and it's also considered the first issue of a long-running series. Eventually, the title was shortened to just Captain Marvel Adventures, that would eventually outsell Superman comics, as Fawcett was wont to boast even back then, and as has been said of Captain Marvel many times since then. So this first issue, and this will be of interest to you, Chris, completely created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Really?
Yes, this is the only time that they worked on Captain Marvel. It was
wow.
It was kind of a rush job.
I didn't know that. Oh,
yes,
wow.
because Fawcett was, again, as with they'd had a big success with special edition comics, and they wanted to get some more all Captain Marvel issues on the shelves. So they assigned this to Simon and Kirby. They were between assignments at the time, and they knocked the whole thing out with a killer deadline. They did it in 2 weeks. Kirby,
64-page comic.
Mhm.
Wow.
This is Kirby, after all. He can work fast when he needs to.
He's legendary for that.
Now, reportedly, Simon and Kirby were not completely satisfied with the results, and they did not sign the work. Not that Fawcett would have let them do that if they'd wanted to, but still, it came together. And I believe if you look at that Chip Kidd book you mentioned earlier, Chris, I think a large portion, if not the entire issue, of this first issue of Captain Marvel Adventures
I'll have to scrutinize that.
in that book. All right, so an assortment of stories here. This is the only Golden Age Captain Marvel comic that was not art directed by C.C. Beck himself, so it was totally outsourced to Simon and Kirby. So Cap gets his first opponent that's really in his weight class. Sivana builds a super android named Z, who has movie star good looks, kind of a little pencil mustache. And he and Captain Marvel tussle. Ultimately, Cap destroys Z. There's a very prolonged fight scene in there, much more dynamic and identifiably Kirby than a lot of the other fight scenes that Captain Marvel has had, which are mainly just a couple of stiff punches.
And we have to remember, this came out when, I'm sorry, 1941?
Yes, in early 41.
This is after they've created Captain America. And because Simon and Kirby only did the first several issues of Captain America before they left timely because they were in a dispute with Martin Goodman, which we talked about in the Marvel History and Captain America Spotlight. So I'm wondering where this kind of falls and all that, actually. That's interesting.
Well, clearly they needed something to do and they couldn't work for timely, so I guess Fawcett came to their rescue there. And they turned it in. Okay, so in addition to the fight with Z, Captain Marvel gets to take another trip into outer space. Another bit of continuity here. It turns out he saved the rocket ship that he used to escape Venus a few issues ago in Wiz Comics, and he uses it to go to Saturn to beat up the Dragon Men of Saturn. We also are treated to Captain America's first cowboy story, Captain America. I keep saying Captain America. Captain
My fault, I mentioned
Marvel out. No, it's my fault, Chris. It's my own dodgy brain. So Captain Marvel out west. So where he beats up some cattle rustlers, and we also see his budding gynophobia on display because the heroine of the story, a lady named Daisy, rushes up to Captain Marvel to plant a kiss on him, and Cap's response is, "Help! Help! Shazam!" And suddenly she's embracing Billy Batson.
The poor boy's got a complex here.
Oh, and this might be... Oh, and the fourth story is Captain Marvel fighting vampires, so his foray into the horror genre there. But now's a good time, I think, to take a quick aside here to note Billy Batson was never terribly concerned about safeguarding his secret identity, it should be mentioned. And a little bit of writing here from the notes of future executive editor Will Lieberson about Billy Batson and Captain Marvel's identity and why it's kind of an open secret in the Fawcett universe. We don't have to, as Superman does, keep everything a deadly secret from everyone. Superman still has to hide somewhere, take off his clothes, carry on as Superman, and then get back into his civvies behind a screen, all in time to emerge and have his friends never suspect a thing. This must get pretty tiresome to the kids, which is the theory we work on in having Billy's changes into Captain Marvel often occur right in front of everybody. In contrast to Superman, Captain Marvel is tied down to no such artificial piece of machinery. He just swings into action so fast that most people haven't time to suspect what has happened to Billy. But of course, there is one person who knows: wily old Sivana. In fact, it gets to the point where eventually there's like a frontispiece or a title page for most Captain Marvel comics, with a table of contents and everything. And there's a little block of text explaining Captain Marvel and Cap and Billy's origin. And the final line of that is, "So amazing is the change," from Billy to Cap, "that most people never even realize what has happened." So it's like a kind of super hypnosis is happening here, where the lightning dazzles people so much that they never put two and two together and realize that the Captain Marvel and Billy might be one and the same person. Everyone in the Fawcett universe seems to be aware that Billy has a connection to Captain Marvel. Anyone who wants to contact Captain Marvel comes to see Billy at his office at Whiz Radio. Some people are even aware that they are one and the same person. I think it's in a time it comes to be portrayed as exclusive knowledge that only members of the Captain Marvel Club are allowed to have. They send in their nickel or their dime membership dues to join the Captain Marvel Club, and suddenly their brain is able to retain the secret that Billy and Cap are one and the same. But everybody else is just like, duh, where did Billy Batson come from? Captain Marvel was here a minute ago. So anyway, that helped Captain Marvel get away from quite a few women who wanted to kiss him and whom he fears like poison. And that is very clearly on display in the first issue of Captain Marvel Adventures #1. About the same time, Fawcett started publishing a comic that was kind of their take on what DC National was doing with their World's Fair comics and World's Finest comics, which is taking a few of their headlining characters and stick them together in a single comic. Not in the same story at first, but in like separate stories in the same comic book. And that was their America's Greatest Comics series. First issue of that was published in spring of 1941. It was like an all-star jam. It had Captain Marvel and Bullet Man and Spy Smasher and Mr. Scarlet and all those guys, and all underneath a cover by Mac Rayboy,
who we should mention he's a legendary artist. I mean, his style is so distinctive, beautiful. I mean, he did the Green Llama, didn't he? Do the Green Llama?
Absolutely did. Yes.
And would you say it's fair to say there's like a painter quality to the covers that he did? And
painter or engraver or just a very detailed illustrator.
It's when I think of Captain Marvel, I think of Beck and I think of Mac Rayboy, basically. When I think of artists who worked on that character.
Is it more likely to be Rayboy or Rayboy? I really don't know.
Will be corrected on the forums, no doubt. I'm not sure, honestly.
Yeah. I hope somebody does, really, because I don't want to be wrong. I've always just said Rayboy, but Rayboy is just as likely to be correct, I think. Mac is short for Emmanuel, by the way. Yeah, so we'll hear more about him when we get to Captain Marvel Jr. But he provided the cover for this first issue of America's Greatest Comics. C.C. Beck later criticized it, saying he was no fan of realistic art in comics. That's the thing. He always considered himself an illustrator and a cartoonist. A good one, one who takes pride in his work, but still, he didn't think that comic art needed to take itself too seriously or strive too much for realism. To him, that made no sense whatsoever to treat fantastic and occasionally ludicrous material, such as superhero comics, with such a realist, artistic eye. And he thought that cover to America's Greatest Comics #1 looked like a bunch of choir boys doing a two-step. So anyway, so the Captain Marvel story in that issue was Captain Marvel goes after the Ghost of the Deep, who was a seagoing saboteur with delusions of conquest. He turned out to be a rival reporter for another news service.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, who wanted to take over the world. Yeah, cool visual though, long black robe with a pointy hood. Okay, so around this time in the spring of 1941, a couple of important developments were happening outside of the comics. First of all, I think sometime in March of 41 was when the first Captain Marvel serial began playing in theaters. Okay, this was put together by the well-known and in the field at least respected schlock factory Republic Pictures.
Did Republic do the Captain America serial? I want to say they did.
I could not tell you that, Chris.
Shane, do you remember?
No, I don't. I'm wondering who did the Batman ones as well.
Okay. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
No, not at all. All right, so it was a 12-part serial. It was called The Adventures of Captain Marvel, starring Tom Tyler as Captain Marvel and Frank Coughlin Jr. as Billy Batson. It was set in Siam, and that is where the young Billy Batson first met Shazam. And
Siam it was set in?
Siam, yes.
Okay, which was
As in
Thailand,
Thailand,
of course,
yeah.
but that's interesting.
Yep. So there was no subway tunnel or anything like that. Billy stumbles into an ancient tomb, meets Shazam there, played by a classically trained actor who filmed his part in one day, and turned into Tom Tyler and went into action as Captain Marvel. And that was that. There was the Fawcett Comics did a couple of things to cross-promote that serial, but that got started then. And that was Captain Marvel's first foray into a media other than comics.
Is it fair to say it didn't have the impact, let's say, like, didn't the Batman serial introduce the Thin Alfred, for example?
Oh,
and
boy.
the Batcave? Am I correct in saying that?
I'm not sure.
Or maybe I'm thinking, I'm thinking of the Batman TV show where they had Alfred Thin,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, the Batman serial was strange.
Yes,
Yes,
I
it
know,
was.
that
It
I
had
know.
Batman and Robin living in a house on Oak Lane, someplace,
Yeah.
like in the suburbs someplace.
And the floppy ears. Anyway, I'm
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Mark, go ahead.
Yes, they looked like Batmite, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
Okay, so that was going on. That was a good development for Fawcett and Captain Marvel. Less good, though, in the March of 1941, DC National issued their first cease and desist order to Fawcett concerning Captain Marvel and his supposed infringement on Superman.
Another skirmish was going to be a very long battle,
Oh,
basically.
yes.
Or war, I should say.
That was the opening shot. Fawcett blithely ignored it completely and just kept on publishing their stuff. And so nothing more was said about it for a little while. Then April 1941, coming back to Whiz Comics, issue number 16. Well, actually, we should go back to number 15 for the start of this, because this is the first ever Fawcett crossover. Talking about there being supposedly no such thing as continuity in Golden Age comics. It was a crossover between different features within the same title. But still, it was fairly...
This is revolutionary stuff.
It's
I wasn't
pretty
aware of
groundbreaking,
what
yeah.
Fawcett was doing.
Yeah, so it began in the Spy Smasher strip in Whiz Comics number 15. Spy Smasher being something of a Batman archetype, broadly defined. I mean, he was a dark vigilante. His first appearance was Whiz number 2, same as Captain Marvel. His secret identity was wealthy Virginia sportsman Alan Armstrong. He was dating the daughter of a naval admiral, and so he had some inside he had an inside source for information about subversive activities, and he deeply hated the enemies of America. So he used his private fortune to build this gyro sub vehicle that he flew around in, made himself a costume and some weapons. He was drawn as very dark and shadowy and kind of Batman-like, really, in his first appearance. He was seen more and more in the light in full color in subsequent appearances. So by number 15, he was a little bit less mysterious. But his fiancée, Eve Corby, the daughter of the Admiral, is the only one who knows his secret. But in Whiz number 15, the Spy Smasher strip there, he was captured by his old enemy, the Mask, and he was strapped down into a brainwashing device called a brainograph. And he was brainwashed into becoming this megalomaniacal, government-despising anarchist
I love his
agent.
catchphrase.
Kill, kill, kill! Still think that Captain Marvel comics were all sweetness and light? That's
Clearly not here.
not here, no. And sure enough, the brainwashing works a little bit too well because Spy Smasher decides to kill the Mask as his first victim. So the Mask is hoisted with his own petard there. And then the Spy Smasher, still believing himself to be an agent of chaos, hating all governments, America's most of all, he embarks on a reign of terror. And that takes us over to Wiz number 16, where we pick up in the Captain Marvel feature. C.C. Beck and Pete Costanza illustrated just about all of the Captain Marvel portions of this little crossover. And the Spy Smasher chapters were by Charles Sultan. And so they sort of play cat and mouse with each other, just back and forth over the course of several issues. This runs from issue 15 in the Spy Smasher chapter there, all the way through number 18. Finally, Captain Marvel is able to corner Spy Smasher in the same chamber where the Mask had brainwashed him in the first place. Spy Smasher, however, destroys the machine, so Captain Marvel is forced to do a more DIY approach to deprogramming. He uses a form of super hypnosis, really. Just like stares at him intensely. And
as you know, well before Superman.
Yes, exactly. It is well before Superman. And I think there's a case to be made for Captain Marvel learning to fly before Superman did, too. I don't want to state that as fact.
Right.
But it's hard to pin down exactly when those two characters stopped, when their giant leaps ended and their flight began. There are those who argue that Cap flew first. And he certainly used super hypnosis first because he just kind of stares into Spy Smasher's eyes and orders him to remember who he really is. Spy Smasher comes back to himself. The two heroes shake hands and part as friends. And all the mayhem and murder that was committed by the Spy Smasher is very quickly and cleanly swept under the rug. So that's how these two, I guess the closest thing I would say to a world's finest duo that Fawcett had here in the early years between a kind of...
What's interesting, though, in the early issues of World's Finest, Superman and Batman never actually interacted in that book.
That's true. They
appeared on the cover, but whereas here, right off the bat, they have these characters interacting. This is fascinating to me. I didn't realize some of the innovative things Fawcett was doing this early on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a reason why these Fawcett stories are so fondly remembered all these years later. All right, so that done. Captain Marvel then moves on from there to Wiz number 19. In this story, Billy Batson is menaced by a kind of a hillbilly black magician, a practitioner of hoodoo arts from the hill country. He overhears Billy Batson's radio program, which reaches far and wide from the superstation Wiz. He hears Billy dismissing folk superstitions of the hill country as just bunk. And he takes that personally, so he and his toadyish son come into the city and capture Billy Batson and try to work him harm. At one point, they sculpt a little voodoo doll, to try and use that to work against Billy. They craft a mask of cheese and put it over the voodoo doll's mouth to keep Billy from speaking, to say his magic word.
Okay, here's a question then. Where do we start to hear about the big cheese? That's not been introduced yet.
I have notes.
Fair enough.
I have notes. Yeah, but definitely not. In fact, well, funny you should mention nicknames for Captain Marvel, because this issue... Okay, so the main reason I'm bothering to make a note of it... Well, first of all, to finish the story here, eventually Billy's... Well, the black magician's cat eats the cheese off the voodoo doll's mouth. Billy regains the ability to speak. He says Shazam, but he's standing near the voodoo doll when he does it. And so since there's a little bit of his hair, I guess, woven into the doll... to make it work its magic against him. A little bit of the magic lightning forks off and strikes the voodoo doll, turns it into a mini Captain Marvel, brings it to life. So it's kind of like the unofficial first
I was eating
member.
I almost choked. So good.
There's the Marvel family right there. Little cousin voodoo doll Marvel. So yeah, that's fun. That's Golden Age fun. And it's in this story. Now, up to this point, Captain Marvel's been referred to by a number of little nicknames. He's most often called the world's mightiest man. Okay, that was from the very first appearance. They've also played around with Earth's mightiest man, the mightiest man in the universe, and the mightiest mortal ever born on Earth. But as far as I can tell from my research, this story, Wiz number 19, is the first time that he's referred to in a narrative caption as the world's mightiest mortal. And eventually that became the official nickname.
Now, is Parker still writing the stories at this point?
At this point, no. In October of 1940, he went away to do a stint in the National Guard.
Are there various writers involved?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Well, this is getting close to wartime here. Even though we're not officially in the war yet, still we're kind of ramping up our military.
And the draft is in place by this point, too.
Yeah, as C.C. Beck once put it, during the war years, artists came and went like leaves in a hurricane. Direct quote from Beck himself. So Parker was one of the early casualties. He wasn't able to stay an entire year with the characters he created. And when he came back from war, he didn't come back to the comics department. He went to work on another Fawcett publication, the magazine Mechanics Illustrated, edited that for a good long time, and ultimately passed away in 1963. So that's what became of Bill Parker.
He couldn't have been that old then.
He wasn't. I think it was a heart attack, actually. And he was succeeded by a man named Rod Reed, an important early Captain Marvel writer. He claims to be the first person after Parker to write a Captain Marvel script, known for his sense of humor, and he eventually became a high-ranked editor at Fawcett. We'll hear a little more of him later on. Okay, so that was Whiz number 19. Moving on to 64 pages of New Captain Marvel Adventures number 2. It was a quarterly book at this point, so in summer of 1941, this time the entire content of the art was farmed out to George Tuska.
Oh, that's a name people should know, especially if you're a Marvel fan from the Bronze Age.
I knew you would know his name. So he drew all 4 stories in this issue. So here we have... let's see. There's a Sivana story, and an example of Sivana forgetting that Beauty is his daughter. He disguises himself as a soda jerk and splashes Captain Marvel
I love
with
that term.
a shrinking solution that shrinks Captain Marvel down, and then he does the same thing to his daughter when she protests. They shrink down into this microscopic world inside of a flower pot. And they have interactions with the germ people who live there. And finally, they find a way to grow themselves back up again and punch Sivana in the face, and the story's over.
I wonder if this is one of the first examples in the age of superheroes of a superhero character being shrunk down into a microscopic world. Because that's a plot device you see over and over again.
All the time.
Yeah.
That's
really interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, there's another story. They're kind of resorting to genre formulae here. So now they're doing a riff on Milton Caniff and his Terry and the Pirates.
Yep.
Billy Batson is shanghaied by pirates of the South Seas. Then Captain Marvel, for the first time, flies into outer space without the aid of a rocket ship or a breathing helmet. So he can not only fly, he can survive without breathing. So poison gas won't affect him much from here on out. He flies to Mars to defeat the villainous, the Martians have sent an army of mechanical Spider-Men to Earth to wreak havoc, and Captain Marvel destroys them, and then he goes back to Mars to cut off the threat at its source. Captain Marvel and the Spiders from Mars, right there for you. And final story in this issue is a fun one for me, because this is a villain that Ordway plucked from obscurity in Power of Shazam once again. Captain Marvel faces the Arson Fiend, who's this funny-looking little man named George D. Tweedle, who walks around trying to sell people fire insurance. But when business is slow, he sits down and develops a serum that transforms him into this gaunt, gargoyle-like pyrokinetic maniac who shrieks, "Ha ha ha ha! Burn! Burn!" Again, not all sweetness and light in the Golden Age for Captain Marvel, people. So, yes, he has the ability to start fires, and he does so to every place of business that refuses to buy fire insurance from George D. Tweedle. Somehow, George Tweedle figures out that Captain Marvel and Billy are one and the same. The villains are more on the ball in these stories than anybody else. But as with a lot of Golden Age villains, the Arson Fiend dies in the end. But then Ordway resurrects him much later. And also in this issue is a little text piece to tie in to the Captain Marvel serial. It's all about the villain of that serial, the Scorpion. Okay, and speaking of the Scorpion, around that same time, in summer of 1941, Fawcett published a series of what they called dime action books, comparable to the Big Little books that you could find on racks in those days. They did a short series of them featuring different Fawcett superhero characters. One of them was Captain Marvel's dime action book, and it had a story called The Return of the Scorpion. It was intended to be kind of a sequel to the Republic serial story.
A little cross-media activity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fawcett's really progressive here. And wouldn't you know, this contains the first written Captain Marvel written work of a legendary writer named Otto Binder. This should be a name well known to fans of Superman as well, because he eventually went over and worked for the hated competition after the Superman and Captain Marvel lawsuit was finally settled.
I didn't realize Binder worked for DC.
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that.
He made some important contributions to the Superman mythos. He's believed to have created Bizarro,
okay.
among other things. And I can easily believe that. It's the kind of character Binder would create. And so Binder he had been active as a science fiction writer for a number of years, and his brother Jack, who was an artist and who had set up his own art shop out in Englewood, New Jersey, and Fawcett gave him and his assistants a lot of work over the years. It was he who talked his brother Otto into trying comics writing, and Otto, who never really wanted to be a writer to begin with, but just kind of backed into it because he discovered he was good at it. He agreed to write comics, and he was kind of hooked. He fell in love with them. He enjoyed them as a storytelling medium. He loved the kind of stories that were told with superhero characters. And he ultimately went on to be the most prolific Captain Marvel writer of them all. Steranko, in his History of Comics here, estimates that there were about 1,740 Captain Marvel, Mary Marvel, and so forth, Marvel family stories told at Fawcett throughout the Golden Age. And of those, he estimates that Otto Binder wrote about 57%.
See, what's so edifying about this is I've always known about Binder, and he's such a dominant figure that I didn't even know about Parker, for example. It's interesting to learn where Binder fits into all this, that he wasn't even there at the very beginning. And I just kind of always blithely assumed, it was always Otto Binder, and it wasn't, which is just interesting.
Yeah. But it's... You can't be blamed for assuming that, Chris, because it is true that Binder really had a much greater impression on Captain Marvel than did the writer who created him. Okay, but so he started off on this big little book, this dime action book. And then there'll be many other stories to come from Otto Binder, of course. Okay, then September of 41, Whiz Comics number 21. Important supporting cast members of the Marvel family are introduced. The first, well, if you don't count the Voodoo Doll, the first members of the Marvel family. And these are the Lieutenant Marvels, also known as the Billy Batsons of America, or, as seen on the cover of Whiz Comics number 21, Captain Marvel's Squadron of Justice. A name that would later be resurrected as the title of a group of Earth-S Fawcett superheroes that crossed over with the Justice League in a Justice League story arc in the 70s. They were called Shazam's Squadron of Justice. But here, the Lieutenant Marvels are Captain Marvel's Squadron of Justice. So this isn't one of those stories that, from bottom up, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. As many stories for children in the Golden Age didn't, let's be honest. So Billy Batson gets a visit from three other boys who are also named Billy Batson, as it turns out, who have come from different parts of the country to visit him at Station WHIZ. They've all been teased by their playmates at different parts of the country. These three Billies came. One was from Texas. He was a tall drink of water. He was nicknamed Tall Billy Batson. One was a fat little guy from Brooklyn. He was called Fat Billy. And then the third one came from the Ozarks someplace, and he was named Hillbilly Batson.
I love that he's called Fat Billy. Is that what he said it was?
Fat
called?
Billy.
I love the sensitivities of the Golden Age. It's fantastic.
He didn't give that nickname
So
to
refreshing
himself,
in a
but
way.
he's from Brooklyn. He was tough. He could take it. So they all had endured some ribbing from their friends because they all read Whiz Comics, we're told. You really got to wonder where they're building the fourth wall on Earth S. Because they all seem to be aware. It's like this open secret on Earth S that Captain Marvel and Billy are one and the same, yet nobody seems to be aware of it at any given time. It's like they're all subliminally aware that they're one and the same person. But so anyway, they're all teased by their friends because their names are Billy Batson, and they keep needling them to say Shazam and see if they'll transform into Captain Marvel. So they made this pilgrimage here to visit the real Billy Batson at his job as a radio announcer, and they give each other nicknames to differentiate themselves one from another, and that's how we get Fat Billy, Tall Billy, Hillbilly, and Real Billy. And all three of these Billy's Batson are they're caricatures of actual Fawcett publication staffers.
Of course.
Hillbilly is based on Ed Hamilton, who I think went on to do some writing for DC. Paul Pack was the inspiration for Tall Billy from Texas, and Frank Taggart was the artist on whom Fat Billy was based.
So did Fawcett have a bullpen, or was a lot of it farmed out, like to the Binders, for example?
Some of each. There were a lot of freelancers. C.C. Beck went off and had his own shop eventually, and then there was the Jack Binder shop, which was actually a renovated barn in his backyard in Englewood, New Jersey. And then there were some staff artists, though, that just kind of lived and worked at the Fawcett offices. And I think at this point, this is September of 41, I'm not sure. I don't know if C.C. Beck had left the Fawcett offices yet to open his own shop. But he went out of his way to include little visual cameos by his friends and fellow staffers. Okay, so anyway, So these guys were basically crude regional stereotypes. You know, they behaved in much the same way you'd expect a stereotypical Brooklynite or...
It's not the golden age without crude regional stereotypes.
Yeah, gee, you said a mouthful, pal.
That's how all the radio shows are
I'm
that I listen to on the radio.
Great, Mert.
So, okay, meanwhile...
Was there a lot of use guys?
Well, it's hard to make the use sound, to phoneticize that in print. But,
Okay.
But yeah, he's a fan of the Dodgers, of course. But anyway, meanwhile, while this is going on, Savannah is organizing a foursome of his own. He calls them his Vengeful Four. It consists of Savannah himself, a generic Nazi, a generic mobster, and a guy named Captain Death. But not the Captain Death. It's not the pirate Captain Death that Cap met back in Wiz number 8. This is a different guy, tall, lanky dude in a red robe. He doesn't really do much in the story except stand around and look off-putting. He looks like a cross between Vincent Price in Mask of the Red Death and Alice the Goon from Popeye. But anyway, these three pieces of furniture join Savannah in his Vengeful Four. He instructs them to kidnap Billy Batson, because he knows that Billy Batson is Captain Marvel, and they all end up kidnapping a different Billy Batson and bringing them all to the old deserted sawmill, where, in a predicament stolen directly from the perils of Pauline, Savannah straps them all to a log, and he's going to put them through this whirling saw blade. And, of course, he and the Vengeful Four don't stick around to see this happen. They leave. But Billy is trying to shout his magic word, but the saw blade is so loud that apparently it's a part of the rules that his word has to be audible in order for it to count. So the machinery drowns out his Shazam, so he doesn't transform into Captain Marvel. So the other three Billy Batsons join their voices to his. They all say Shazam together as loud as they can, and as a result, all four are transformed into red-suited, lightning-wielding, Shazam power heroes.
Are they all clones, or they look different?
They look different.
Okay.
They all look like adult versions of themselves.
Okay.
So they have different hair colors. You can tell if you look at them closely which one is which. And together they track down and defeat the Vengeful Four, and the story ends as they all go their separate ways, but agreeing that they're never going to call on their Shazam powers unless they're all together. Okay, so real Billy's the only one who can be active as a Shazam champion. The others have to say Shazam in concert with him for their powers to count. Otherwise, they're cheating or something. Eventually, they break this rule to save Billy from danger, of course. But at first, that is the agreement. That's the pact they enter into. And so are formed the Lieutenant Marvels, because as Tall Billy points out, there ain't but one Captain Marvel. We're more like second Lieutenant Marvels. And so there you go, your first members of the Marvel family. Now we get to the third issue of Captain Marvel Adventures, Fall of 41. This again was all drawn by George Tuska. Another Savannah story, actually two Savannah stories in this issue. Savannah comes as close to conquering the United States as he ever will, using a ploy involving a paralyzing gas. And we get some acknowledgement again that Beautia is his daughter. So that's starting to sink into the writer's minds that Beautia is his daughter. And then there's another Savannah story in that same issue where he creates a synthetic human being called the Beast Ruler. Or as I like to call him, the Tarzan droid, because he's supposed to be a Tarzan knockoff. He hates humankind, identifies with animals, and quickly whips up this army of wild animals to take down civilization. Captain Marvel, meanwhile, forms a competing army of domestic animals loyal to humanity, dogs and horses and such, and takes them down. And the Beast Ruler is, of course, destroyed by the end of the story. Okay, now, we come to September of 1941. This is when DC National officially files their lawsuit against Fawcett over Captain Marvel. And they, devious bastards that they are, they name a few other producers of Captain Marvel merchandise, including Republic Pictures, who produced that film serial, as, co-litiges or whatever you'd call it, co-defendants. And this was a brilliant move on their part because this kind of scared away prospective business partners from Fawcett. So that made it that much more difficult for Fawcett to cash in on their Captain Marvel characters. That's hurting them in their pocketbook. They couldn't find people to produce, market, and distribute their merchandise. So, you were talking about how the sheer bulk of Captain Marvel tie-in goods that are in that Chip Kidd book that you have, Chris. It's that much more impressive when you realize that Fawcett basically had to do all that stuff in-house.
Right, I would imagine
themselves.
so. Now, at this point, is Captain Marvel outselling Superman?
I am not certain.
Okay, because that did happen at one point,
as
we noted earlier.
Happened for a couple of years.
Now, this went on, as we know, it went on into the 50s.
Yes, it did.
Is that because Fawcett just was strenuous about their lawyers fighting this lawsuit all that time, basically?
It went back and forth. There were a few different reversals, a few different appeals. And I think Fawcett won a long-term reprieve in the early 40s, in the fairly early years of the ongoing trial, when they argued successfully, at least temporarily, that Superman, his patent had been improperly filed somehow. So he was based on a faulty patent.
So essentially a
faulty
technicality was
trademark.
helping them out
yeah,
there.
That's exactly right. It was a kind of a loophole. So, but that was enough for the courts, and so that bought Captain Marvel some more years of life. I don't know exactly when that argument was made. I didn't really make much effort to research the trial.
Well, that's a
very
whole
thoroughly.
nother...
Yeah, that's another episode,
Yeah,
and we need Joe Sergi's help
Yes,
to do that.
I was just thinking that, yep.
Do one of his famous superhero sidebars for us. Okay, but that's when the battle really began in earnest between DC and Fawcett.
And again, thanks to all the wonderful edification you're providing us, Murd, beyond just they're both strong, they have dark hair, there's no similarities. I mean,
no.
The power set is different. I mean, the origin,
The secret identity is a
Captain Marvel
12-year-old
is not
kid.
he's not an alien. I mean,
supporting
it's,
cast?
It's absurd. It's
Other
totally
than
absurd.
than being a news reporter of some kind,
Yeah.
nothing.
This is all about, oh God, this guy's catching up to us. We got to get him out of the picture, basically, because it's going to cost us money.
That's what it was all about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you for reminding me that he's a reporter, Shane, too, because I had wanted to mention that in a lot of his early stories, Billy is seen running around with a giant transistor, a transmitter pack on his back, big antenna sticking out of it, so he can broadcast the news on site. And we in the recent Multiversity Thunderworld Adventures. We actually
That was
see.
magnificent, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I loved
I
it.
didn't get to read that yet.
It's so good.
Yeah, I can appreciate it even more now that I've seen some of
I can imagine, yeah.
more of the source material. Okay, so let's see. Wiz number 22. Now, this is just about the only time in the Golden Age this happened, but C.C. Beck actually wrote and drew this story by himself. Kind of ironic because the story is a sequel to the Republic Adventures of Captain Marvel serial, which Beck hated. So it's a story that you mentioned earlier. You wondered earlier, Shane, whether or not that serial had that great an impact on the portrayal of Captain Marvel in other media. Well, this is one of the few instances when that's true, because here we see the crossover of a supporting character from that serial into the comics continuity. This is a guy named Whitey Murphy. He's kind of like the bumbling Jimmy Olsen figure. He's a bit of an albino too. His skin is pinkish and his hair is white, hence the name Whitey. So he shows up at Wiz Radio. And he reminds Billy of that time that they were down in Siam with Professor Malcolm. So that tells you that a version of what happened in the Republic serial also happened on Earth S in the comics.
But I love the fact that they're referring to previous stories, and they're establishing at least a loose continuity and a world building, which is just you didn't see that in the other companies. Really, it's great.
All right, so so together they discover that Professor Malcolm is in trouble. This is another character from the serial, and Billy and Whitey set off to rescue him. They have to go down to Central America and raid the Temple of Itzalarahui. See,
Only Murr could say that with the right amount of gravity.
It's funnier when you say it aloud, isn't it? So, yeah, and they rescue Professor Malcolm with a little help from a native girl. And also, I have here in my notes, it's Billy's first accidental Shazam. The first time he says the word Shazam, it is transformed without really meaning to do it. It's done here for a humorous effect. I think it's Beck just proving to everybody that it would happen that way if Billy said the word without meaning to say it. So that's the first time that happened. All right, now, in October of 1941, 64 pages of new Captain Marvel Adventures finally shortens its title to Captain Marvel Adventures, hence, hereafter we're just going to say CMA. So here's the fourth issue of that in October of 1941. Here the art chores are all assigned to, it's still like a 64-page comic with 4 Captain Marvel stories on average, and the Jack Binder studio out in Inglewood. Again, that's Otto's older brother. And his assistants, most of which were graduates of the Pratt Institute of Commercial Art in Brooklyn. A couple of well-known names to come through there. I think Chick Stone worked at the Binder studio for a little while.
He later inked Silver Age Kirby on Fantastic Four.
Bill Ward, who was a fairly well-known Good Girl artist. And Kurt Schaffenberger, who became a very influential Captain Marvel artist as the Golden Age wore on and came to D.C. to take over for C.C. Beck after he jumped ship.
Did Schaffenberger ever do Superman? Or no?
I'm pretty sure he did.
I feel like he did.
Yeah. So he came up through the ranks in the Binder studio too. Okay, so in this issue, We've got another Lieutenant Marvel story fairly soon after their first appearance. And again, Sivana is trying to get revenge on them, and it doesn't quite work out for them. And in another story, Captain Marvel has his first confrontation with Hitler. Now, Fawcett is still being a little bit coy about the whole America versus Axis situation. So Hitler is not directly named in the story, and he's been mentioned offhand in a number of earlier stories. They've always referred to him as the Warlord, just sort of crude translations of Führer, I assume, in English. But this is the first time that Captain Marvel comes face-to-face with him. And this is very shortly before the United States is officially involved in World War II. So Captain Marvel foils a plot to build an invasion tunnel under the Atlantic Ocean to get to the United States. And then he comes face-to-face with Hitler, and he has some special words for him. Oh, yes, let's see if I can dig that up here. Oh, yes. He declines to actually arrest or kill Hitler at this point. He just glares at him and says, "No, not yet. You'll have to die at a special time in a special way." So that it will be
very
meaningful and
interesting.
instructive to the rest
Now,
of
it's
the world.
obviously Hitler, although he's not named.
Yes, very clearly Hitler. Mustache, swastika armband. It's unmistakable.
Huh.
But they didn't actually. Well, I think someone calls him. No, I'm thinking ahead. Someone calls him Adolf eventually, but it's not in this story. It's in the first appearance of Captain Nazi a little bit later on. Oh, and speaking of which, we're almost to that point. First, we've got a rare 2-issue to be continued type story in Whiz Comics number 23 and 24. It's just Billy and Whitey Murphy and Mr. Morris hunting spies at a ritzy masquerade ball. And the story involves a secret code that spies are trying to steal. So that code figures in the story. And it eventually is revealed that this code will be given out to members of the newly formed Captain Marvel Club. And so this was the whole story turns out to be just a plug for the new Captain Marvel Club, which is kind of like an answer to DC's Supermen of America group.
And I think Timely had a Captain America club. I know they had a pin, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They all did if the character had that much of a presence.
Yeah, the Cap Club definitely had a pin. And he also had a code translator, little paper disc that could help you. The code, it would get a lot of use by Fawcett over the years. It was a part of the story in this first 2-part thing, but later on it would be used to send messages to readers outside of stories. At the end of every part of the Mr. Mind's Monster Society serial, for example, had a little message in code. If you decoded it, it would tell you the title of the next chapter. A little bit of a spoiler out of that. It was just a simple alphabet substitution code for those who were interested. You just look at each letter of the alphabet and count how many letters in from the beginning or end of the alphabet it was, and you could just figure out which letter it was supposed to be. So if you saw an A, it was really a Z, and vice versa. You saw a B, it was really a Y. You saw an X, it was really a C, and so forth. But in case you didn't feel like working that on your head, you could pay your 5-cent dues to become a member of the Captain Marvel Club, and you'd get occasional letters from Captain Marvel. You'd get opportunities to buy Captain Marvel merchandise because, as we've just said, DC, with their lawsuit, made it that much harder for Fawcett to get their goods into the people's hands. So this was a way for them to direct market to their readers.
You know what ticks me off about
club.
that? I realize, even back then, you think about how litigious we are today, but DC was doing that back then. It's in a way it's cowardly because Fawcett is just out. They're beating you in the competition, right?
Fair and square.
Fair and square. Just people are more. I mean, I love Superman, but Captain Marvel was selling better. And instead of trying to do things with Superman that maybe would make it more compelling for readers, so then you could beat Fawcett's numbers. You resort to this craven tact of going through the courts. I just find it despicable, frankly. It really irks me. It's
water along under the bridge.
True, granted, but
it still puts a different light on what you think of as DC these days. If you didn't know,
yeah,
and cruel to make the irony even crueler. A lot of Fawcett staffers then ended up working at DC afterwards.
What choice would they have?
Pete Costanza, Otto Binder, Schaeffenberger,
DC was the Cadillac of comic book companies, so.
Yep, pretty close to, well, not the only game in town, but getting closer to at that time. All right, let's see here. So after that story, then we come into an intertitle crossover, not just between strips in one series, but intertitle. So beginning in December of 1941. Oh, yes, quite a...
Well, we're talking Pearl Harbor.
Yes, we certainly are.
Although this would have been created before Pearl Harbor happened, I would imagine. But
so by odd coincidence, it happened to hit stands.
Yeah.
So we've got an overtly Nazi antagonist, so overtly that he's actually called Captain Nazi. Right. This is his first appearance, Master Comics number 21, December 1941. Handpicked by Adolf Hitler himself, and Hitler is called by his first name in that story, I think. And he's revealing Captain Nazi to his inner circle as he shows off his feats of strength.
Is this like the Fawcett Red Skull? Is it fair to say that in a way? Or?
I don't think he compares all that.
No, okay.
Well, I haven't read enough Golden Age Captain America to really know. I mean, wasn't the Red Skull revealed in his first appearance to be an American businessman? Who was like George Maxson, I think his name was.
But
and then later on they brought
he
in
died, and they said that he was just a proxy for the real Red Skull, if I remember correctly.
Captain Nazi is a bit less threatening. I mean, he's got superhuman powers going for him. He is superhumanly strong and swift and agile, and his body is difficult to injure. He can't fly at first. He eventually gains that ability. But at first, and he doesn't have a cape either. He just wears this green military outfit, epaulettes, giant black circle with a white swastika in the middle of it. No, he's definitely an ideological personification here. So he has that in common with the Red Skull, at least. And he's got this cruel-looking scar down the side of his face, which he incurred in a duel at Heidelberg, we're told in his first appearance.
So maybe he was a Prussian Junker, like part of the old German landed nobility.
Could be. So he is dispatched by Hitler himself to just foment mayhem and insurrect and just do bad things over in America. And Captain Marvel and Bullet Man in the Bullet Man story in Master Comics number 21 shake hands. They meet face-to-face for the first time, and they agree to join forces to eliminate this threat on their shores. So Captain Nazi, as I said, he's strong and invulnerable. He's got all the powers, but he shows himself to be a cowardly snake almost from the very start. I mean, he's almost as fond of cheesy disguises as Dr. Sivana is. He slinks away from battles that are going against him. He does things. He sabotages and subterfuges, and it just does things underhandedly all the time. And worst of all, he routinely endangers children, using them as human shields, throwing them to their deaths.
You can't get more villainous than that.
To force the hero into saving the child while he makes his getaway. So fitting that his chief antagonist, then, his sparring partner, his foil, turns out to be a young hero himself, as we shall see very soon. So there's a little bit of a chase between Captain Marvel, Bullet Man, and Captain Nazi, and Nazi escapes at the end. And then we cross over to Whiz Comics number 25, which is the first appearance of Captain Marvel's young friend and ally, Captain Marvel Jr. I hesitate to call him a sidekick because the two of them really aren't seen together often enough in stories for him to...
Oh, is that the case? They were not really?
Yeah.
He would just have his own solo adventures, basically?
Yes. Okay. Well, they met again, of course, but not very frequently, really. Jr. was off doing his own thing in his own series, and Captain Marvel was off doing his thing in Whiz Comics and Captain Marvel Adventures, and they rarely even saw each other. And even if they did, Captain Marvel would not condescend so much to Captain Marvel Jr. as to treat him like a sidekick, especially since the way Captain Marvel Jr. is portrayed in these stories, just the general tone of the stories, is really a bit more mature in feel. Well, as we construct maturity nowadays, anyway.
Right.
And then I'll have a few words to say about that in just a sec here. But so Whiz Comics number 25. It's Captain Marvel Jr.'s origin, and Captain Nazi is right at the heart of that. He directly causes Captain Marvel Jr.'s origin, in fact. So Captains Marvel and Nazi are fighting each other still. Captain Nazi directly attacks Whiz Radio, and Whitey Murphy, the supporting character, is nearly killed. But Cap is able to prevent that, just barely. Captain Nazi tries to destroy a large dam nearby. Captain Marvel puts the kibosh on that. The two trade blows on board a plane that Nazi is trying to commandeer. Captain Marvel knocks him off the plane. Again, he can't fly. Nazi can't. So he falls into a lake below. A kindly old man in a fishing boat on that lake rescues Captain Nazi. And Nazi just says, "Ha! Soft-hearted fools! Here is how I repay your kindness!" And he just kills the man right there.
That was a great Golden Age Nazi accent. Well done.
Yes, the dialects become thicker and thicker as we get deeper and deeper into the war, of course, and the ethnic stereotypes become worse and worse.
Oh, it's part and parcel.
The Japanese are particularly maligned.
Oh, well, between the bright yellow skin, the buck teeth, and the glasses, how can you come on.
All of that is happening at Fawcett. But not just yet. But here we are, and it's still Whiz Comics number 25. So Captain Nazi's just killed this kindly old man, and his grandson tries to intervene, and Captain Nazi whacks him and mortally wounds him, too. Captain Marvel sees all of this and swoops down to save Billy. Well, not Billy. Freddy is the young boy's name. He's about 14 years old. And he's the grandson of the man who was killed. And Captain Nazi slinks away while this is happening, of course. Captain Marvel's only concern is getting this boy to a hospital, where he's told that the boy does not have a very good chance of survival. Medicine can't save him. So, frantically, badly distraught, Captain Marvel flies with this injured Freddie Freeman, the young boy's name is Freddie Freeman, to old Shazam's cave. And this is the first time that Billy's been back here since Whiz Comics number 3B, I think it was. So he lights the brazier behind old Shazam's throne, and Shazam, he interacts directly with the spirit of Shazam for the first time. He pleads with Shazam if there's not something he can do magically to save Freddy's life.
Has the wizard not been seen yet up to this point since the first appearance?
Nope.
Really? Okay.
Wow.
No, but here he
That's
is.
a while. All
Wow.
right.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
But he needs to be back here for the origin of another important character. So he tells Billy that he can't just heal Freddy outright, but Captain Marvel has it within his power to share his power with Freddy. So Billy says, "Okay, sure, fine, we'll do this." Then Freddy comes to, and he says, "Captain Marvel," and a magic bolt of lightning strikes him. That becomes his magic change word, because you have to say the name of the person or persons giving you the power. So Billy gets his powers from the wizard Shazam, but Captain Marvel Jr. siphons his power from Captain Marvel, putting him in the awkward position of being one of the few superhero characters out there who can't say his own name without compromising himself in battle. So he gets all the same powers that Billy has. He just has to say a different word to trigger him. He does not turn into an idealized adult version of himself, though. He just stays more or less the same as he usually is, except hale and hearty and strong, whereas in his normal mortal form of Freddie Freeman, he is crippled for life.
So he's essentially the same age
Yes.
in this transformation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Freddie and Captain Marvel Jr. are virtually identical. Same age.
Just more robust physically.
Yes.
Okay.
As Freddie is, he's got a lame leg now, thanks to Captain Nazi, and he'll deal with that for the rest of his life. He's always shown on crutches. All right, so it was. I think C.C. Beck described him as kind of a cross between Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol and Peter Pan.
What I find interesting here is you note that Raboy would draw the Junior Freddy panels because Beck did not like Mac Raboy's art.
Yeah, well,
Wow.
Raboy was assigned those panels because he was going to be drawing
Right.
the ongoing Captain Marvel
his
Jr.
solo
feature in
feature,
Master
yeah.
Comics. So he was allowed to draw the Freddy and Captain Marvel Jr. panels in this issue, and it's kind of
That must have been an interesting contrast.
Yeah,
It must have
because
been jarring, right?
Yeah, Beck and his
Yeah.
assistants were still drawing the rest of the issue,
Right.
And Beck had gone on record as saying that he didn't much care for Raboy's art style, tried for pretentiously realistic.
Huh.
But so it was that Freddie Freeman gained the alter ego of Captain Marvel Jr. And then we crossed back over to Master Comics number 20. Oh, geez, I've lost
22.
my
22.
Thank you. And that's where Freddy, he arrives, meets Bullet Man over there in the Bullet Man strip and says that he's been sent over from Whiz Comics by Captain Marvel to help track down Captain Nazi.
Wow,
See,
talking
these-
about fourth wall
yeah,
again.
these characters
Yeah.
just casually discuss the comics they're appearing in as if they're. I just got over from Whiz Comics, and boy, are my arms tired. You know? It's like he's talking about taking the 10:30 in from Newark. So yeah, it's kind of funny. And so there's a story there with Captain Marvel Jr. and Bullet Man ganging up on Captain Nazi, and Nazi slips away. And Nazi would end up being the recurring antagonist in Junior's strip. All right, and then Master Comics became Captain Marvel Jr.'s new home. After his appearance in number 22, his own solo strip began in 23. He gets a job as a newsboy, which is something that a lame boy could do. And we see the little... what is it called? An out-of-the-way shack. That's his place where he lives. We see a lot more of his home life, as lonely and empty as it is, than we do of Billy's home life.
So with his death of his grandfather, he had no other relatives of any kind?
He was
Okay.
effectively an orphan at that
Okay.
point. His parents had died quite some time ago.
Okay.
He had gone to live with his grandfather, and so that was it for him. And so he became an orphan newsboy, just as Billy Batson was when he first appeared.
Well, and while Billy's working as a news reporter, he still lives at the orphanage?
No, he was out of the orphanage some time ago.
Okay.
Eventually,
I might have missed that.
The way I'm doping it out in my head here, he was sent to an orphanage at birth. Eventually, his wicked uncle adopted him and then immediately kicked him out in the street once he got his hands on Billy's inheritance.
Okay.
And that's how he ended up on the streets living in the subway station and selling papers.
Okay.
So then this is how Freddy happened to be an orphan, but he's a little bit older at this point. As I alluded to earlier, well, let me throw out there, too, that Captain Marvel Jr. was originally conceived by Fawcett editor Ed France Heron, who's another Fawcett staffer who ended up working at DC later on. His stories, as I said before, were a little bit more mature in tone. Probably because, funnily enough, even though his empowered state is the same age as his non-empowered state, he's always like 14 years old. He doesn't become an adult. But his stories are, funnily enough, aimed at a slightly older audience, I think, a slightly older kid.
Interesting.
Who's just starting to breach adolescence and getting that taste of adult responsibilities and adult powers. You know, just shy of having the full power of an adult human being, an adult citizen of the United States.
So does he not go into catatonia when a girl's around?
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure how many girls he actually gets around, funnily. So anyway, he just... You can sort of see in him the kind of fervid emotional response of many real youngsters about that early teenaged phase to the onset of World War II. That's why I think he's more engrossed in fighting Nazis than Captain Marvel was at that same time, although Marvel would certainly fight his share of Nazis.
That's a brilliant stroke on Fawcett's part in terms of marketing a particular type of character that works for a very particular demographic of that time period. It's very smart.
Yep. And as I said, Captain Nazi became his recurring arch foe. And the art, of course, is provided by Matt Grabois, and who is was known around the Fawcett Studios for being kind of a moody, introspective, slightly surly, self-abusing perfectionist. He was kind of distrustful of authority. He quarreled with his editors occasionally, although usually the quarrels were at the level of a mumble. He wasn't all that articulate from some accounts I've read. He argued with just about every writer he ever worked with about the scripts because he complained he didn't have enough room to draw these beautiful pictures that he wanted to draw. He probably had it in to be a fine artist, but economic concerns forced him to work in comics where the money and the ready work was. He was routinely fighting against deadlines because he always took too much time putting too much detail into his drawings.
Just when you look at his covers, I mean, they're breathtaking.
He was such a self-abusing perfectionist. And he drew with his left hand, too. Another fun little detail. He was known to destroy entire completed pages of artwork because either he was dissatisfied with them or he was upset that somebody else had made some remark about them that he interpreted as criticism.
Oh, jeez.
Which made his art harder on himself. So to compensate for all of this, other Fawcett staffers kind of learned to do Grabois swipes. Or they made heavy uses of self-swiping, where they just took photostatic images of completed panels or existing backgrounds that he'd already drawn and just reused them over and over again in his stories. So there's Junior. He was a resident of Master Comics for a good long time and eventually got his own series. And we will eventually hear some notes about Captain Marvel Jr. and his solo adventures, some highlights. In a future installment, which were compiled by my friend and our listener, Bill Dowdy, the library boy on the forums. Sorry, Bill, that we're not getting to use your notes in this particular episode, but the producer's making the slash mark across his throat, so I'm afraid what was going to be part 1 of 2 is going to be more likely part 1 of 3 or 4 of Captain Marvel in the Golden Age. Future ages won't take quite as much time to go through, but there's just such a boatload of Captain Marvel material.
And we want to address all of it and give all of it its due.
As much as we possibly can. So this episode is now going to cover just the years 1940 and 1941 because the introduction of Captain Marvel Jr. takes us right to the end of 41 and just about the time when America is entering the global conflict that was World War II, which will change the complexion of Captain Marvel's comics, comic books in general, and just American life in general.
Indeed.
Wow. Murd, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
That was as good as a spotlight can possibly be.
Yeah.
Simply outstanding.
Labor of love,
Yes,
my friends.
absolutely.
I've always loved Captain Marvel, and now I feel like
believe me, you're doing him justice here.
trying to rope all of you in.
Well, there's certainly, like you said, there's so much that starts in these first year and a half, 2 years that lasts throughout his entire existence.
Yep, it'll be easier to encapsulate some of this stuff later on. We don't have quite so many major characters' origin stories to talk about, especially when we get into like the late 40s, early 50s.
Just amazing.
And again, I'm just thrilled to be a student here because I didn't realize how innovative Fawcett was.
No,
for that
I didn't
time
either.
Period. And that's so impressive. And just how what's the right term here? Just the wealth and diversity of Captain Marvel's universe already in these early stages and what they're establishing. It's just, as someone who loves the history of comics, both the medium and the characters and the creators, this is very exciting to be learning about because Captain Marvel sometimes gets overshadowed in our popular culture by Superman. Mm-hmm. But he's got a whole robust history of his own that is well worth exploring, and I'm really glad we're doing this. Bravo, Murd. Bravo.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks
Should
much.
See the resource material Murd brought in. It was a whole satchel full.
Oh man, I've got this Spider-Man drawstring bag that Chris gave me for Christmas a few years ago, and I loaded it up with all these archives and faucet companions and good Lord, all the notes I took. I took both sides, even at the small size I write.
Oh my God.
Both sides of a sheet of legal pad paper and 2 sheets of typing. This is just my notes on Captain Marvel Adventures.
Not double spaced, ladies and gentlemen.
No.
No, and a very small
printed.
font.
Tiny print.
It's like a 4-point.
Wow.
But we'll get back to that
Yeah, absolutely.
at a later time.
Not too distant, though.
No, not at all.
Yep, even if we have to do it via the wonder of Skype. Maybe like Billy Batson with his transistor on his back.
I'll be there.
We'll just do it long distance.
Shaney Poo, why don't you take us out there,
Shaney
brother?
Poo. Thanks, Tootsie. This episode was brought to you by Comic Castle. Go to comiccastle.com and support them. They're longtime listeners of the show. Check out their back issues, their collectibles, statues, pop figures, Star Wars, Star Trek stuff. It's all good stuff. Check it out. That's comiccastle.com. Whoop. Gosh, see, now I'm not ready for my own music. There we go. That's right. Visit us at comicgeekspeak.com to send an email. The address is comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. To leave us a voicemail, the number is 267-702-6642. Stop by the Comic Forums and comment on this episode. Let us know what your experience with Captain Marvel is. Follow us on Twitter. Like us on Facebook. We would like to thank everyone who contributes to the show. We really do appreciate it. Please continue to send in Muddle the Murds. I was looking for some, but there was no way I was interrupting all that. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time.
Uniting the world.